Ladies and gentlemen, today is August the 22nd, 2021, and we are joining you for World Discussion with Agent Smith. I'm going to jump in the voice channel, and we're going to talk about what's been going on in the world, and maybe take some questions from the chat. Who knows? Agent Smith.
Hello?
Agent Smith.
Hey, how are you?
Agent Smith. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Can't complain.
First question, did you do the quest?
Kind of. I didn't walk around the block, but I did end up going on a trip. And I did walk a fair bit during that, which was probably the equivalent of walking for 20 minutes.
That's a pass. I didn't say you specifically needed to walk around your block. So the criteria has been satisfied. Well done. We had multiple viewers just tune in. There was someone Thursday who was like, I did the Agent Smith quest. I walked for 20 minutes. And I was like, yeah.
Nice.
We're starting a phenomenon here.
Yeah, good. Keep up the good work. And it's good to exercise. It's a hard habit to get into, but once you get into it, it tends to be self-sustaining. Or at least that was my experience anyway.
It's counterintuitive because you think if I spend energy, I'll be more tired. But there's a sort of uncanny valley where if you exert yourself a little bit, like going for a walk, oftentimes you'll get the juices flowing, get your energy going, and you feel more energized after it if you're not doing some like Herculean physical feat, but it's like light exercise. Well, good job. So we got the Afghanistan narrative is one of those that's like moving hella fast. So whatever you have for us on that one, there were some people asking about the equipment left behind. I saw a headline about there's a women's robotics team or something that they ended up escaping successfully, and then just kind of what the overall response of different countries is and what the Taliban is up to.
Okay. So the girls' robotics team made it out to Qatar, which is where they are right now.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to be fine. I don't know exactly how they got out. I would assume that they got out in a Kabul airport with a lot of other people, but I don't know that for sure. But regardless, they did escape, so they at least are safe for the moment. Um, as for the military equipment, that's probably not going to be that big a deal in the long run. You know, American equipment is generally high quality, but it also tends to be high maintenance, which is both expensive and requires expertise. Uh, and both of those are going to be problems for the Taliban because they don't have a whole lot of money to work with, and they really don't have a whole lot of technical expertise. So that's going to be a problem for them if they want to continue using captured American equipment. I doubt it'll be much use for very long.
Would that be how to operate the equipment and then also how to fix it if it breaks and what the upkeep would be?
Yeah, they do have some pilots who defected and, probably some mechanics, but I don't think it'll be enough to really maintain their stuff because I don't think they have more technical experts available to them than the Afghan government did.
Mm-hmm.
And the Afghan government did not have enough to continue to maintain that equipment. Most of the maintenance was being done by private contractors, and they largely pulled out when the U.S. did, which is one of the big contributing factors to why the ANA wasn't able to hold out for very long. So, yeah, the military equipment isn't a big deal to me. I don't think that's going to be too big a problem. Uh, for the smaller stuff like the small arms, M4 carbines and M16s and all that jazz, that could be a problem, but I don't know that it's really any different than getting Kalashnikovs, which are pretty much always readily available in much of the developing world. They practically grow on trees. I don't remember what the statistic was, but the Soviets built and exported just a massive number of AK-47s over the course of the Cold War, and they're pretty reliable weapons. overall. They're kind of built to last,
I've also
and
heard
they're
that they're
simple.
really easy to operate too.
Yeah, they're easy to operate. They don't break down easily. So there's just a lot of those around. And while they may not be as high quality in some regards as American rifles, uh, they get the job done. So I don't know that they're really going to get that much of a benefit from having, Western assault rifles as opposed to Kalashnikovs.
Mhm.
Maybe somebody knows more about the subject than I do can elaborate on that. I'm not a the usual disclaimer is that I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, painfully obvious at times. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So chat is encouraged to participate in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will see it later. I can't really walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, unfortunately. So yeah, that's the usual disclaimer. So if I'm talking out of my ass here about the Western assault rifles and whatnot, let me know. But other than the small arms, a lot of the bigger equipment I don't think is going to last very long. They won't be able to really maintain it, I don't think.
So it wasn't like they left a full military base and like missile launching stuff so that they changed the Taliban's power level in the region. It's more so, yeah, they did leave some equipment behind, but it's not really going to be a game changer for them.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, it could be that I don't think it's really equivalent to the Sahel, which I think is what a lot of people are thinking
What's
of
the
when they,
Sahel?
that's sort of that region between the Sahara Desert and sub-Saharan Africa. It's sort of a transitory region, geographically speaking. It's not defined by tropical and subtropical jungles and forests like a lot of sub-Saharan Africa is. But it's not fully desert either, like the Sahara Desert is. It's sort of this semi-arid region with lots of plains. That's again just between the Sahara Desert and sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a pretty long belt of land like that just continues from the west coast to East Africa. And there's been a lot of violence in the Sahel over the past 10 years. There kind of always had been, and to one degree or another, because a lot of the people that live there are nomadic peoples of various kinds. And nomadic peoples, historically speaking, don't generally get along with sedentary peoples, the farmers, the city people, etc. They just kind of have divergent interests. But the problem more recently was the Libyan civil war, or maybe more specifically, the Arab Spring, as it applied to Libya. As a result of the collapse of Libya's government, a lot of the Libyan army's weapons ended up in the hands of various militant groups operating in the Sahel, specifically Mali. And some of those groups were able to defeat the Mali army and seize a significant amount of territory in northern Mali. And they were actually on the verge of seizing the capital at one point before French intervention kind of turned them back. So that was considered a either direct or indirect, depending on who you ask, a result of the Libyan government's collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And an example of what happens if weapons, significant amounts of modern weaponry ends up in the hands of rebel groups or terrorists or however you want to frame them. So people are kind of thinking in similar terms with regard to the Taliban. The thinking is that maybe now that the Taliban have these weapons, that they're going to be able to undermine surrounding states in the same way that the militant groups in Mali were able to. But I don't think it's really a comparable circumstance. The states around Afghanistan are much stronger than the states in the Sahel for the most part. Pakistan isn't probably too worried about it since they basically fund the Taliban and have a lot of influence over them. Some of the Russian aligned states like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, probably won't be too worried about it because they've got the Russian army to help them. Uh, Turkmenistan is kind of a hermit kingdom, but I doubt they'll have any problems really. It's a totalitarian state basically, so there's going to be limited room to operate. So they're probably not going to be able to bring down that state. Uzbekistan is pretty powerful. That's the strongest government in Central Asia other than Russia, basically. So I think they'll be able to contain any threat from the Taliban. And Iran is already, an Islamist republic. So That would be a sectarian conflict if it happened, but I don't think it will. I think the Iranian government is pretty interested in maintaining normalcy on its eastern border so it can focus on the drama on its western border, of which there is a considerable amount. There's not great relations between Iran and the Taliban, but I don't think either is really interested in messing with the other at this point. Both of them have bigger problems. So that's pretty much every country on Afghanistan's border. So there's not really like an easy path of expansion for the Taliban. So I don't really see that as being an issue. You could say that they could give small arms and other weapons to terrorist groups. That's possible. And those terrorist groups could go to other countries and cause trouble. But I doubt that there's anything they could give them that they wouldn't be able to get in a host country anyway, either legally or on the black market. Well, maybe not host country, but target country, let's say. I mean, yeah, you can't buy like a Humvee or a Stinger missile on the black market probably in most countries, but those aren't the kinds of things that a terrorist group really needs. I mean, if you're a terrorist, you're probably either interested in explosives so that you can set off some kind of bomb, or you're just in need of a semi-automatic weapon of some kind so that you can just randomly kill people, which has kind of been more the pattern in recent years. So in that sense, there's not a whole lot the Taliban can really offer terrorist groups. What they can offer is maybe something like a what they call a safe haven. The idea is that they can create training camps. And, honestly, the training camp thing is a little overdone. People kind of make it out like terrorists can go there and they can kind of learn how to be more effective and learn how to use, better weapons, better tactics. And, that's technically true, but that's not really the biggest advantage of a safe haven like that. The biggest advantage is networking. It's not too easy to network if you're a radical Islamist, because everybody and their mother is keeping an eye on you. Intelligence agencies from all over the world are very cognizant of the fact that radical jihadists are a threat and go out of their way to monitor them wherever they can. So that makes it a little difficult to kind of network and build up networks of people from which you can draw human resources in order to engage in jihad, to engage in terrorist activity. So a safe haven like that allows like-minded people from potentially all over the world to congregate in one place and to basically get in each other's Rolodexes, so to speak. They can kind of know who to call if they want to plan something or if they need something or what have you. So that's more the problem with the safe havens rather than, safe havens producing bigger, badder terrorists. So that's going to be a running concern. It's not really clear what the Taliban is going to do as far as terrorism, though. Because on the one hand, you can argue that they've just defeated a superpower and they can do whatever they want. And if they want to help out jihadists around the world, who's going to stop them? But you could also counter that the last time they did that, they ended up getting their asses kicked and ended up in exile in Pakistan for a number of years. And that it ultimately took a very violent, bloody 20-year war to get back into power. So maybe the United States wouldn't necessarily just reinvade Afghanistan on a dime if they started supporting terrorists again, but there are certainly things the US could do that would make them very unhappy. And the things they have in mind would probably not involve hearts and minds. The US may not be very good at state building, but it can do very good when it comes to state busting. And in so much as the Taliban are interested in building a state, the United States can make that very, very difficult. So there's definitely an incentive there for them not to support terrorists, or at least not to do so in the same way they were before 2001. So I don't know that it's inevitable that they'll end up doing that. But the counter-argument there is that even if they don't want to support and host terrorists, they may not have a lot of choice, because right now their state capacity is very low. Like we were talking about last time, the Taliban government is not in well, the Taliban government is a coalition of a lot of different groups, and it's not very centralized. So it's not entirely clear if they even have the state capacity in order to have the state authority necessary to prevent terrorist groups from operating and operate in their territory. So it could be that even if they don't want them there, they'll be there. And so that pretty much isn't really any different than them just allowing to be there, at least as far as Western security concerns go. So if that's the case, then the U.S. and other, like-minded governments concerned about terrorism will have to figure out something to do about that. But you could also argue that the United States doesn't really have to worry about it because now it's a regional problem. It's not as though states in the region are super happy about the Taliban being in power. Pakistan probably is. Pakistan is this is kind of what Pakistan wanted from the start. They want their strategic depth. The Pakistani military, which basically controls the country, is institutionally paranoid about India. That's their big bugbear. And so their big thing for decades has been that they want to make sure Afghanistan never allies with India, such that they would have to worry about a two-front war. So they're very insistent that Afghanistan not be aligned with India, and the best way they think they can ensure that is to have either a puppet government or at least a government that they have significant leverage over in power in Kabul, which they now have, as they did before 2001. So they're pretty okay with this outcome overall, although there are some reasons they shouldn't be. The Taliban are mostly a Pashtun organization, and there are a lot of Pashtuns in the region that are not particularly happy with the Pakistani government, kind of for a lot of reasons, but among them is a sort of century-long border dispute in which some of the Pashtuns in Pakistan, specifically the Northwest Frontier Province in Pakistan, think that they should not be part of Pakistan. And even if you go back to like the independence movement in British India, a lot of the Pashtuns there never really wanted to be a part of the Muslim Indian state that the Muslim League was talking about carving out of British India. So, even before Pakistan existed, the Pashtuns were not interested in being part of Pakistan. They just kind of were forced into it by dint of British colonial policy there at the end of their term in India. So the Pashtuns are not entirely happy with Pakistan, and that could be a problem if the Taliban end up pushing more Pashtun nationalism than they do Islamism. So we'll see how that goes. But for the most part, Islamabad is kind of okay with the outcome so far. But other states in the region, like Russia, Iran, like I said before, they can contain the Taliban, but that doesn't mean they like them. And there's always the potential that the Taliban, or at least some of the radical elements within the Taliban, may support terrorist activity in Central Asia outside of Afghanistan. And that's going to be a problem for both Tehran and Moscow, because they both would probably be the targets of that violence, one way or the other. So there's not really any significant U.S. interests in Central Asia, such that it would be a problem for us. If the Taliban want to go out of their way to mess with the U.S. and their interests, they would have to travel a ways outside of Afghanistan to do it. There are targets of opportunity in the region that are much closer, basically, and that will probably be more the focus for extremists in Afghanistan. So if the Taliban do support terrorists again, odds are it's going to be something that Moscow and Tehran work together to try to contain. So it may not require a whole lot of US input in that sense, although I suspect the CIA would probably get involved in some capacity, probably intelligence sharing and whatnot, and possibly some assassinations. But other than that, yeah, I don't know that the US is necessarily the worst off for this. A lot of the terrorist activity will probably be directed towards the region. But we'll see. I mean, all of that is a long-winded way of saying we don't know what the Taliban are going to do about terrorism. It's not clear if Afghanistan is going to be the sort of nexus of international jihadism that some commentators are saying it will be. I don't think that's inevitable. And even if it does, it's probably going to be more of a regional problem than an American problem.
Yeah, well, this also started with the question of how big of a deal is it that the U.S. left some equipment behind? Short answer, not a huge deal. I guess the board is different for this situation than it is from the Sahel, which is just north of the Sahara, running east and west across Africa. So
south of the Sahara.
South of the Sahara, thank you. They found equipment, and it was a bigger impact there because there was less resistance. But you're saying in Central Asia, the neighboring states are pretty strong, so it's not like you can just get a fancy gun pickup and then suddenly you're the dominating force in the region.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. The states in the region are not super strong, especially Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, but the difference is that they have a treaty alliance with Russia, and there are actually Russian troops deployed there. So that's a little different than the circumstances in Mali back in 2011 or whenever it was. They didn't have any French troops deployed. They'd kind of tried to minimize French influence for a long time, and they didn't have any treaty allies to kind of help them out. So they were pretty much on their own, and so they were a relatively easy target. And also, there had been a rebellion in the northern part of Mali for a long time before that. That's I think it's the Berbers there, or is it the Tuareg? I think it's the Tuaregs. I can never remember. One of them is sort of in the west of the Sahara, and the other one is in the east, and both of them are nomadic groups indigenous to the Sahara Desert. They're actually a really interesting group. But they've never gotten along with the central government in Mali. They don't like that the government just kind of ignores them because there's not very many of them. Most of the population is in the south. That's where most of the farms are, most of the cities. The north is just mostly desert and it's very sparsely populated. So the government doesn't give a shit about them. They didn't like that. And so they've been fighting a war of independence basically to try to break off that northern piece of Mali where the Tuaregs live so that they can have their own state. So the Islamists in the region found that an easy group to ally with, since most of them were Muslims. And when a lot of those jihadis were able to get weapons from basically Libyan army surplus, so to speak, they were able to make good use of them with their allies there. So I don't see much of an equivalent. There is like a ethnic low, what would you call it? A low intensity conflict, low intensity insurgency in Baluchistan, which is in both Iran and Pakistan, although I think Pakistani Baluchistan has most of the activity. So you could say that the Taliban could help them out, but I don't know that they would be very receptive to that necessarily. And again, I think if the Taliban did anything with Pakistan, it would have to do with the Pashtun areas, not the Baluch areas. But yeah, I don't think the Sahel is necessarily equivalent here. I don't think that's the precedent that we really should look at.
It's a different map.
Yeah, like you said, the map is different.
That's a good breakdown. I think a pretty standard example too of how you could have a clickbaity headline that, oh my god, the U.S. government left behind tons of huge supplies. Boom, 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 boom. Now the Taliban has this huge power level and they're going to take control of everything. It was a huge mistake. Or you left a couple really choice rifles behind that could help out a couple people using them. But aside from that, like how do you send that in for repairs? I'm thinking about it like you're getting a car. If you get a cheap car that everyone has, if it breaks, it's super easy to find a spare part for that. If you have a choice cutting edge American rifle, where do you go to repair that? You can't really go to the U.S. government and say, hey, so I found this rifle and I was looking to see if I could send it in for repairs.
Well, the rifle repair isn't too big a deal. I think it's more like the heavy equipment, stuff like the helicopters, the planes, the Humvees. The heavy stuff is the stuff that is going to be the biggest problem in terms of repair.
Hi, I'm calling about a helicopter repair.
Yeah, that ain't gonna happen. That ain't gonna work for them. I think I did read somewhere that maybe they would try to get like the Russians or the Chinese to jump in and help them kind of maintain stuff and repair it, but I don't think they're gonna be game for that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think, I don't think that they're interested in helping the Taliban improve their military. They might cut deals with them to invest in stuff like mining or maybe rails or some other type of economic activity. They could make some money off of that. But I don't think arms deals are really in the cards, or at least I doubt they will be. Because again, I think they're going to want to wait for at least a couple months to see what the Taliban are going to do and see whether the extremist factions are the more powerful and just how much power the central Taliban state is going to have before they even think about doing anything with them, first of all. Because if they do start supporting terrorists, they're not going to maintain relations.
Mm-hmm.
There's no point in that. At that point, they're a real threat. So they're going to focus on containing them in that case. But even if they do turn out to be relatively moderate, that is to say, the Taliban, uh, arms deals are a stretch, man. That's taking a big risk with regional security. It's a lot easier to focus on stupid shit like, I'll give you a development loan and you can develop this region, or I'll give you medical care, or just, simple stuff like that. That's just easy diplomacy and it doesn't have any contradictions with regional security from the perspective of Moscow or Beijing.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, you can think of that stuff as paying off the Taliban to behave. And, I think there's going to be a lot of that going forward, honestly. I think even the US and Europe will be doing that.
Well,
Because
this
thus
is
far,
all if they can establish a legitimate government.
well, it's not going to be legitimate, at least not in the eyes of the West. There's just no way the West is going to recognize an authoritarian country as the legitimate government. They'll do it for the Saudis. Some people like to say, well, we do it with the Saudis. Why not with Afghanistan or this, that, or the other state? But, the reason that the Saudis get recognition is strategic. It doesn't have anything to do with human rights. If not for that strategic imperative, the West would probably throw them under a bus in a heartbeat. So Afghanistan doesn't have a massive strategic resource. It's not located in a strategic part of the world. It's just kind of crammed in between a whole bunch of countries that don't like the United States. In that sense, it's remarkable the U.S. was ever able to be there in the first place. If you look at a map, there's no way for the U.S. to get to Afghanistan without going through a state that does not want it to be there. So the 20-year mission there really, and the fact that the U.S. was able to maintain a 20-year mission there is testament to the sheer degree of American power that exists. Without a lot of economic and military leverage, the United States government would never have been able to convince Pakistan and Russia to allow them to use their territory to move logistical supplies, troops, aircraft, weapons, etc., through their territory to even get to Afghanistan in the first place. I think I got off of my point. What was I on about?
We're talking about the relationship of Afghanistan in the region, why we have a strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia, and if we would
Oh,
seek out a
recognition. Yeah,
similar.
they're not gonna. Yeah, yeah. I don't think they'll extend recognition to the Taliban. But I think what they might do is that they might continue foreign aid if certain discrete conditions are met. So basically, the West doesn't really care about Afghanistan enough to really fight for them like they sometimes say they would, but they do care about certain kinds of human rights like female education, not slaughtering ethnic minorities, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
So, in order to try to encourage the Taliban not to offend Western sensibilities in that regard, they may offer to continue foreign aid to, say, girls' schools or schools in general, maybe medical support, healthcare. They may continue foreign aid to those kinds of projects if the Taliban refrain from, say, banning girls from school or committing genocide or whatever other kind of atrocity that the West suspects the Taliban of wanting to do. And the Taliban may be game to do that because that's just basically free money for them. They can use that for whatever to build their state, to pay off people in their patronage network, to buy weapons or anything. So, in that sense, the West may end up paying the Taliban to behave themselves. Could be a kind of tribute that we just sort of pay to them in order to avoid terrorist attacks or whatever else. But I think, again, that the Russians, the Iranians, and also the Chinese will be a lot more interested in that. So I suspect if that does happen, we won't be the only ones pitching in.
Mhm.
But that's all a lot of ifs, ands, and buts. It's all just early days yet, and we really don't know what direction things are going to go.
I was
So we'll
seeing
see.
different headlines throughout the week that there's a resistance force that's retaken certain districts of Kabul and other places. What is the scale and situation of that?
It's really small. Panjshir is what they're talking about, and it's located in the Panjshir Valley. And there's a warlord there named Masood, and he's the son of another famous warlord who actually used to lead the Northern Alliance. And they're both, they've been based there in Panjshir Valley for a long time. So the Taliban were not able to conquer Panjshir, but it's not clear that it's really going to matter. It's a tiny territory. They have a decent number of troops, and they're supposedly getting more former Afghan commandos and other former members of the ANA that are supposedly going there and are willing to fight. But I don't know if it's going to be enough because they're just completely surrounded. They have no airport, so they don't really have means of getting air support or logistical support by air anyway. And yeah, their position is just strategically screwed pretty much. It's not entirely clear to me just what they can do. I mean, the territory is really difficult to take, so I don't know that the Taliban will be able to force their hand and conquer it, but they don't necessarily need to. It's, probably good enough for the Taliban just to put them under de facto siege. So it seems more likely to me that Panjshir is probably going to end up cutting a deal with the Taliban of some kind. I don't think the West is super interested in propping up another proxy in Afghanistan because it's not going to be entirely clear just what they're going to do. Because, like we were talking about last time, the smarter thing for the West to do, even if it would have been very unpopular and brutal, would have been to prop up warlords in Afghanistan and use them as Western proxies. But a lot of those guys are drug dealers. They're extremely violent. One of them, a guy named Dostum, is sort of infamous in Afghanistan for murdering prisoners. They're not popular guys in Afghanistan or outside. They violate human rights. I mean, there's just a long list of reasons why the West would not and should not support warlords in Afghanistan like that. So those are kind of the kinds of people that we would have to prop up if we wanted to prop up some kind of insurgency in Afghanistan against the Taliban. Maybe that ends up being worthwhile if the extremist factions in the Taliban are ascendant and they start supporting terrorist attacks overseas. In that case, we might do it anyway, but at least for now, I don't think any foreign aid is going to be forthcoming. So they're probably going to be on their own for the foreseeable future. And I think once they realize that, they're probably just going to cut a deal and just be another subsidiary of the Taliban government. I had some stuff for you, but yeah, you're busy right now.
You
So
can
I'll
send
send
it.
it a
I can
little
open it
later.
after this.
Sorry, what?
You can send it and I can open it after. It's no big deal.
Yeah, that'll work. Yeah, I just had some images and videos from, Reddit, pretty much all Reddit. And I thought it was worth looking at for maybe anybody who hasn't seen it yet. I don't know how much you've been paying attention to Reddit over the past week. Let's see. I guess I'll just copy paste the whole thing. Let's see how that works. There you are. I think my favorite one was the Taliban and bumper cars. That was a weird one.
Why are they in bumper cars?
Basically, there is like an amusement park just outside of Kabul near like a reservoir.
Mm-hmm.
And the Taliban took it, when over the course of Kabul falling, and some of them decided to use the bumper cars. And so there's video of these grizzled veteran Taliban fighters screwing around on bumper cars. Just when you think you've seen everything.
But you haven't seen this.
Yeah, let me see if I can find the. Yeah, I don't really have too much to update on. Like, there's not a whole lot of new developments. It's pretty much just the US government and allied governments trying to extract as many people as they can as quickly as they can. It's obviously turned into something of a debacle. I don't think anybody expected, well, some people expected the Afghan government to collapse as quickly as it did. But it seems pretty obvious to me that the US government and other governments either didn't expect it to fall this quickly or were really hoping it wouldn't. One way or the other, they did not put in the planning or the contingency planning in preparation of this kind of event. So it's pretty obvious they're playing catch up at this point. We'll see if they're able to kind of get out all the people they want to. I doubt it. I think at the very least, the US will try to get out all of the US citizens. That's just kind of a political requirement. I don't think any government would be able to get away with doing otherwise. But as far as Afghan allies, interpreters, and whatnot, I don't know if they're going to get out a whole lot of those guys. Because there's just a lot of them. There's a lot of people who have worked with either the US or other allied governments. And a lot of them are stuck in different parts of Afghanistan. And it's not clear to me that they're gonna be able to get to Kabul airport without encountering, this, that, or the other Taliban patrol. So unless you're already in Kabul, or were already in Kabul when it fell, your odds of getting to the airport and getting out are not great. And even if you get to the airport, it's not entirely clear that you'll be able to get on a plane. You got to have the right paperwork. And even then, they may not let you in for, whatever reason. It's just very crowded and chaotic around the airport right now. So not everybody who has the correct and proper paperwork is necessarily getting to the front of the line. I think even a lot of US citizens are having to kind of shelter in place and wait for helicopters to come and get them because it's just too dangerous to make it to the airport in some cases. Let's see. Oh, there was some people talking about Islamic State. Some people comparing how, yeah, Islamic kind of the Taliban taking over is similar to how the Islamic State expanded into Afghanistan, but it's not really quite the same thing. Islamic State never had the legitimacy the Taliban do. The Taliban have a really solid ground game. Say what you will about the Taliban, but they know how to do grassroots politics. They really did a pretty good job over the past 10 years in particular of building up support amongst local tribes and intertwining their people with local tribes, such that they had a lot of local allies. So they were pretty solidly embedded in local institutions to a degree that the Afghan government just never was. So in that sense, they were much better and smarter than the Islamic State, which was basically just a hardcore band of militants that took advantage of a security vacuum. They didn't cultivate deep ties with communities. The most they did is ally with pre-existing insurgent groups. In particular in Iraq, there was a lot of Sunni people who had been members of the Iraqi army or who had been personnel, bureaucrats, what have you, in Saddam Hussein's government. And a lot of them were obviously upset that they'd kind of been marginalized in post-war Iraq. So they were attractive allies for Islamic State, and they worked together in the early stages of the conflict. That was a major reason they were able to blow through so easily. But it didn't take long for the Islamic State to alienate them, like it alienated everybody. So they were not really popular at all. They only were able to gain any ground with local insurgent groups because the Iraqi government was so unpopular. But once they were gone, the Islamic State kind of turned on them. And after that, it was just a matter of time before they were pushed out by one group or the other. With the Taliban, it's just very different. The Taliban actually did a much smarter, better job of ingratiating themselves with the locals and not pissing them off. Certainly, there are examples of Taliban atrocities, but overall, the Taliban have a much stronger claim to legitimacy in Afghanistan than the ANA ever did, at least at this point. Maybe they won't for long. We'll see. But it's worth pointing out that also the Taliban are much more decentralized. Part of the way that they ingratiated themselves is by working with local elites rather than trying to dominate local elites. The Islamic State was almost a fascist organization. They wanted their state to be the dominant political entity where they governed, and they didn't tolerate any competing, poles of power within their territory. And that was another reason that they weren't able to survive. They were just terrible coalition builders. The Taliban, in contrast, are much better. It remains to be seen whether or not the coalitions can last past the collapse of their main enemy, but at least for now, their coalition seems much more resilient than anything the Islamic State was ever able to build.
Holy crap. Looking at these pictures and images. I won't show all these on stream because some of them are pretty brutal. But basically video footage of people really clamoring for planes and stuff and how jam-packed some of these big Air Force planes are. These are huge planes.
Yeah, those are C-17 Globemasters. At least I think they are. I would imagine the US is probably sending in some C-5s, but I think the ones that I've seen thus far have mostly been C-17s.
Jeez Louise. Yeah, and the people who are like hanging onto the side, that's not a
Yeah, that's not a pro gamer move.
that's not a good idea. So there's a level of velocity that the plane will reach when it's at cruising speed that is so fast that Even if you're a very, very strong person, it's too much resistance on yourself. Don't do that.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard about the guy who fell off the plane. I mean, there's been several
Yeah.
who just tried to hang on to the plane and didn't make it, but one of them was a soccer player. He was like a 19-year-old player for Afghanistan's national soccer team. So very young guy. And those are the kinds of people kind of looking to get out, people who have ties to the Afghan government and Afghan national institutions under what had been the Afghan national government. Those are the kinds of people who are worried the Taliban will come after them.
And the Taliban would be, I guess this is more of like a, I guess, religious political question. They would want to be striving for a Sharia law government rather than a more Western kind of, I guess the law is above a biblical text, a religious text.
Yeah, Sharia law is what they're going to implement. They've already said that, repeatedly. That's going to be their main focus as far
Mm-hmm.
as governance. What that looks like in practice is debatable. There's lots of different ways to interpret Sharia law. It was particularly strict back before 2001, but it's not clear if they're going to do that again now. They've been, it's been a pretty mixed bag thus far. Like, there have been some reports of girls being turned away from school and women being turned away from work. And there's been some examples of revenge killings that we know about. But there's also been examples of girls being allowed to go to school, women being allowed to go to work. I think there was one female journalist who actually was allowed to do a TV interview with one of the Taliban spokesmen. So thus far, the Taliban have been sending mixed signals about their intentions as far as implementing Sharia law. So it's not clear just how they're going to do that. It could be that they're just waiting for the US to fully pull out, because right now there's still like, 5,000, 6,000 US troops just kind of hanging out around the airport. So that's not great if you're Taliban. It's probably a little nerve-wracking. Uh, you know, it's true that they could probably do some damage since they've got the US forces there completely surrounded, but it's also true that the US can do considerable damage if backed into a corner. So I suspect that's the main reason why the Taliban have been willing to kind of let all of the airport drama play out rather than trying to force the US's hand and make them leave. They'll probably just kind of sit it out and let the US do what it does there, try to evacuate people for another, week or however long it takes.
Yeah, it seems like it's a bit of a standoff where that's a place where the U.S. could draw a really hard line. Like if you swarm the airport and try to contest this evacuation, then we might raise the level of violence. So it seems like the Taliban is choosing not to raise because they don't want to escalate things further. They're more or less happy with this outcome of the U.S. getting big planes and flying people out.
Yeah, yeah, it's just an unnecessary risk from their point of view. They've already got the country,
Hmm.
like all of it, except for, Panjshir Valley and whatnot, maybe a few other pockets. But yeah, they've pretty much won, and attacking the US doesn't do anything except bring on unnecessary violence. So, when you're at the finish line, why stumble? Just kind of let things run their course, and then you've got it. So they'll probably just kind of stay passive, at least for the moment. Yeah, it's also worth mentioning here, kind of going back to Iraq, that in the Afghan example, the state totally collapsed. Like it's not there anymore. Whereas with Iraq, the state did not fully collapse. It just lost all of the territory in which it had pretty much zero legitimacy. All the parts of Iraq that had Shia or Kurdish populations, they stood up and fought. They mobilized militias and helped prop up the state. And so because of that, the Iraqi state was able to survive. Afghanistan did not have that. There wasn't any part of Afghanistan, even in the parts that had traditionally been readouts of opposition to the Taliban, where there was an obvious point. There was an obvious resistance group that kind of came up in resistance to the Taliban. One of the interesting things I read over the past week is that the Taliban didn't just go out of their way to ingratiate themselves with communities in Taliban, in Afghanistan. They went out of their way to target ethnic minorities that had previously opposed them before 2001. And that's one of the reasons they were able to take the north of the country so easily in the past couple months. You might have expected the north of the country to be the bastion of resistance to the Taliban, because that's where the bastion of resistance to the Taliban had been before 2001. That's where the Northern Alliance was concentrated. But the Taliban has recruited heavily in that region over the past 10 years. And, they probably don't have as much support there as they do in the Pashtun areas in the south, but they have a hell of a lot more than they did 10 years ago. And that again is testament to their ground game, their grassroots politics. They may not have had a more powerful military than the U.S., but they were much better at building legitimacy and building alliances than the U.S. or the Afghan government ever was. And that obviously has paid benefits here, now at the end of the conflict.
One of the things that jumps out at me with that relationship between the U.S. military being there and the Taliban being there is building legitimacy with a people is often about being for the people and being here to stay. And you can assert that you're for X, Y, or Z, but for them to actually believe you, you have to come to their rescue a few times for them to trust that you're actually for them and you're looking after their better interests and their survival. So I saw a few videos of U.S. military personnel there training Afghan soldiers and whatnot, and they're speaking to them in English, and there's like a translator between them. It's not like these are military personnel who are here to stay for decades and kind of oversee the nation building and so on. It's more so it felt a little bit like a bare minimum, but you could tell there wasn't that like unity between the U.S. military and the Afghan military in a really strong sense of the word.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the problems the Afghan military had was that they were only able to recruit from mostly the ethnic minority regions.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the problems, in Afghanistan is that people from different parts of the country don't really interact that much per se.
Mm-hmm.
People are heavily local. And that being the case, if the Afghan government and its institutions were mostly manned by people from the north, Tajiks, Uzbeks, whatnot, people in the south were always going to kind of look at them as foreigners, even though they were technically from the same country. And it also was a problem because Tajiks, Uzbeks, and other people from the north of the country were never going to act the same way in the south of the country that they would in their own territory. And so that kind of facilitated a greater propensity towards abuse, exploitation, and corruption. Because if you're an Uzbek commander, garrisoned in the south, what's your incentive not to alienate the population? You're a relatively strong military figure in the area, and you can kind of afford to basically tax, quote unquote, the civilians to your heart's content or otherwise engage in whatever corrupt activity you want in order to make money. So, winning hearts and minds was not necessarily the main focus there. A lot of domestic Afghan politics, even outside of the military, was focused on basically access to illicit gains from the abuse of government positions. So the whole focus of Afghan governance and institutions was just wrong-headed. I mean, there was never enough of a national identity to get people to focus on building a state and building legitimacy. It was just always on short-term gains. And, like you say, the camaraderie between the Afghan forces and the U.S. forces was not always there.
Well, it's not a long-standing alliance, because I think to develop real trust, you have to go through a bunch of stuff together. So, say, for example, the U.S. and Britain, we fought together in World War II, World War I, and that kind of thing, and engaged in multiple other conflicts since then. So, and there's a bunch of cultural overlap as well. So I feel like the desire to go to the aid of the Britons if they're attacked for the American military is stronger, and they can communicate more easily, and they have more just culture in common with each other.
Yeah.
Afghanistan is very, very far away from the U.S., and developing a relationship and developing trust is really hard to do, and it takes a really long time.
Yeah, unfortunately so. And, even after 20 years, they hadn't really done that in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a documentary that was made by Vice News called "This Is What Victory Looks Like," and that was actually The documentary I was thinking of last week. I think I mistakenly identified it as Restrepo, but that was a different documentary, although still a good one worth watching. But This Is What Victory Looks Like also did a very good job of kind of outlining a lot of the institutional problems with the Afghan military. So I would definitely encourage those interested to check that out. It's free on YouTube. Vice kind of puts a lot of their stuff on YouTube, so you don't have to like hunt around and buy it or something like that. It's just right there. So that's definitely worth a watch if you've got the time.
And it's sort of a sarcastic title, right? Of like what we declared as victory versus what actually happened.
All right, what?
The documentary is a sort of semi-sarcastic title in the sense that it wasn't a long-standing, really substantial victory. It was showing a lot of the
No.
flaws in what the U.S. left behind in Afghanistan, more or less.
Well, here's the
State
thing.
of
The
things.
documentary was made in 2013,
Uh-huh.
so it was made a while ago. So it wasn't even like the victory had been declared yet.
Mm.
That was a point in time. This is back like just before the U.S. Drew down, quote unquote, in Afghanistan. This is back when the U.S. still had ground troops in Afghanistan and was trying to transition into a support role, wherein the U.S. would only have air assets, intelligence agencies, and logistical support for the Afghan army. Those were meant to be the only roles for the United States after the drawdown. And so the Afghan army was supposed to be put in a position during that transition period where they could kind of survive on their own with relatively minimal U.S. support. And the documentary kind of illustrated how that wasn't really happening. And you can see a lot of the same problems that eventually brought down the government later on, just in the institutions the interviewer looked at. Some of the local police forces and local garrisons that he talked to, exhibited just all of the problems that we've been talking about, and probably a number that I haven't mentioned. So, yeah, it was a mess. It's no surprise that it didn't work out in the long run. Oh, did you get that link I sent you in Facebook?
No. What
Yeah, it
was
was I was talking about that custom, that's the what I should have called it, where young boys are abused.
it? Mm.
And I sent you the link to the Wikipedia article for that. It was like something that started with a D. I don't even remember what it was off the top of my head. But I sent you a link to that, and I sent you a link to the play that I mentioned that was based on that. Let's see, what else did we have in here? So some people were asking, just in chat and on Reddit and other places that I've kind of been looking and following commentary on this. One of the questions that people ask is, why aren't the Afghan people fighting against the terrorists? I mean, the easy answer there is that they don't have the weapons or the resources to do that. You're talking about a group that is not above assassinating people. It's not like they have an easily recognizable front line or easily recognizable soldiers. A lot of Taliban are just dudes who live in your neighborhood. So if you kill them, there's probably just going to be more who come by and murder you when you're in the field or murder you when you're sleeping, or they can just come by anytime they want. It's not like Afghanistan is a super secure place. There's lots of vulnerabilities.
So it's more of a citizens' army than a bunch of professionals.
Yeah, it's like a rebel guerrilla army. They operate amongst and within the population. So it's the overlap between the Taliban armed forces and just people who sympathize with them is pretty razor thin. There's a lot of overlap, really, in practice. And, pretty much every successful guerrilla war every successful, insurgent group has exhibited that, has done that. It just makes it a lot harder to identify who their people are and kill them or capture them. And it also that makes it much scarier, much more difficult for the civilian population to turn on you because they never know who among them is going to turn on them. If they find out that you tried to turn in somebody or tried to inform on somebody or what have you, they can very easily come after you and punish you for that. That was something the Viet Cong did back in Vietnam. If you tried to work with the government, a lot of the time they would find out and they would retaliate against you. So if you know that you're going to be retaliated against, or at least there's a very high likelihood of you being retaliated against, and that the likelihood of anything of significance coming from informing on the Viet Cong or the Taliban or whomever is relatively low, it doesn't really make sense to work with the government. So that's another one of the problems that the US had in Afghanistan. And that's one of the reasons people didn't really rise up and fight. Again, like I was saying earlier, the Taliban have been very good about infiltrating, well, maybe not even infiltrating, just sort of creating coalitions amongst local power elites. So, it could very well be that your brother-in-law is one of the Taliban. So if that's the case, you have a very strong incentive not to turn on him. Not only because the Taliban would probably find out about it, but also because he's family, and you're not really supposed to turn on family. So there's a very strong sort of, I guess, filial duty, if you like, not to turn in family members like that. It's also worth noting here that a lot of people in rural Afghanistan had no idea why the US was there in the first place. One of the things I read is that it was not uncommon for people in Afghanistan, again, rural Afghanistan, to have never heard of 9/11. Like they just didn't know about it. So from their perspective, the fact that the US was there was just like this random foreign power running around in their country. So if that's the framing, it's not really much surprise that they didn't sympathize much with the government that the US created. From their perspective, it was just a foreign imposed government and that it didn't have any business being there. It was even worse that the US wasn't a Muslim country. Bad enough to have foreigners running around Afghanistan. It was even worse that they weren't Muslim. That's kind of a trigger for a lot of Afghans. There's not a lot of nationalism per se in Afghanistan, but there is a very strong Muslim identity. And one of the things that's rallied Afghanistan as a country over the course of its history is rallying to push out non-Muslim invaders of one sort or another. That's what they did with the British, it's what they did with the Soviets, and it's what they ended up doing with the US. Now, let's see. Did we have any questions? I'm just kind of
Yes.
picking through some. Sorry, what?
Moss is taking questions.
Okay, let me check that. Okay. Are there any specifics about what was left behind there besides a people in distress? I mean, in terms of equipment or kind of more abstractly, like the overarching government institutions and whatnot? I mean, in terms of government institutions, technically the state bureaucracy is still intact, and the Taliban has been trying to convince government workers to go back to work. I kind of think that they want to have access to the kinds of state resources and state powers, state capacity, basically, that the old Afghan government had, only under their management. Whether or not that actually works out in practice is going to be largely a function of whether or not people think that they're going to be killed for having worked with a foreign government. Again, that's still kind of up in the air as to what the Taliban are going to do about that. But, in so much as the Taliban do want to have more state capacity and a relatively centralized government, you could say that one of the incentives they have not to be brutal and to actually honor the amnesty that they announced is that, if government workers do come back to work, that is of benefit to the Taliban because that just makes it easier to administrate the country. So those institutions could survive if the Taliban play their cards right. We'll see on that. In terms of equipment, I mean, I don't have anything specific I can point to right now other than what you can see in pictures. I know that the Taliban have been flying around in some of the helicopters, so obviously they have pilots for that. I think the helicopters were largely Russian, not American. The US didn't actually give them, well, they didn't, the Afghans themselves were largely responsible for procurement of equipment, and American equipment was kind of too expensive for them. And also, they didn't really have any expertise or spare parts for American stuff, whereas they did still have some spare parts and expertise residual from the Soviet war in the 80s. The Afghan army, back when it was communist, basically, obviously had access to a lot of Russian equipment. And so there's a lot of, spare parts and people who were trained to handle Russian equipment. Relatively speaking, still not enough to really run it reliably, but they were there anyway. So the Afghan government that the US set up ended up buying a lot of Russian military equipment. So that's largely the kinds of heavy stuff that they've been using, helicopters, planes. Although I think they did buy Super Tucanos. I think that's a South American plane, if I'm not mistaken. Thought that was an interesting procurement choice on their part. But yeah, that's sort of the main heavy equipment that they were left. There's also been a lot of Humvees, there's lots of pictures of them. But yeah, I don't have like a specific list of stuff that was left behind that I could kind of point to. If you're asking about like legacy in terms of like what kind of impact will of the 20-year conflict have had in the long run? That's a tough question. I mean, it just kind of depends on how much the Taliban want to undo, or if they want to undo it. I mean, hypothetically, they could just go full Pol Pot and try to obliterate any and all Western influence from the country. That would be immensely violent. It would probably do a lot of damage, not only to the country as a whole, but also to their ability to govern it, which probably won't work out for them in the long run. So I don't think they'll do that probably, but they still could do a lot to roll back certain gains, or at least what people in the West would think of as gains. So that's just kind of a question mark right now. Very much in their court. Kind of like what I mentioned earlier, the West could offer foreign aid in exchange for maintaining some of the gains that have been made, like girls' education and stuff like that. So that's certainly a possibility as well. But, just all of it is a function of Taliban will at this point. It's pretty much up to them. But yeah, it's a little bit of an open-ended question, so I don't entirely know what direction to go with it. If I ever don't answer somebody's question to their satisfaction, please feel free to elaborate, and I'm happy to kind of return to it. I don't always get the gist of a question on the first go. I'm not the best at reading questions and their intent. 12 Pool asked, is it fair to say that the war against the Taliban was a proxy war with Pakistan then? What is the diplomatic status of Pakistan with the US and other regional powers? It was not entirely a proxy war with Pakistan because Pakistan also allied nominally with the United States. And there were actually parts of the Taliban that went to war with Pakistan. One of the most infamous terrorist attacks in Pakistan was a Pakistani Taliban attack on a military school for the children of soldiers in the Pakistani military. And that suicide attack killed several dozen children. The Pakistani government was most displeased, suffice to say. So the Pakistani army actually took a pretty considerable amount of casualties trying to fight the Pakistani Taliban. And the US was pretty content to work with them to try to contain them. So it's not as though the fight against the Taliban was entirely a proxy war with Pakistan. I think it would be more accurate to say it was a proxy war with the ISI. And the ISI is the the main intelligence agency of Pakistan. It's basically their equivalent of the CIA. And they've long been kind of semi-autonomous within Pakistan. Just how much authority the military actually has over them is not entirely clear. So the ISI has been very keen on making sure that whatever government exists in Afghanistan is subservient to Pakistani strategic considerations, which again is mostly India. And they definitely went out of their way to maintain ties to the Taliban. For those who don't know, the main headquarters for the Taliban is a city called Quetta, or Quetta. I don't quite know the correct pronunciation, but it's a city called Quetta located in Pakistan, and it's right across the border from Afghanistan. It's located in Baluchistan, I think, which is a southwestern province, the most southwesterly province of Pakistan. And the Taliban, sort of Taliban Central, the main organizational structure that kind of governs the Taliban, just operates out of that city relatively openly. It's like an open secret that they operate there. And wasn't a whole lot the US could kind of do about that. We just kind of let it slide, mostly because we knew if we did otherwise, it would be a problem for Islamabad.
Would
At
you say
least
the
that's
name of that city is?
uh, it's spelled Quetta, and I want to pronounce it Quetta, but I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation. But yeah, that was sort of their main area, and their leadership is actually still there right now. They haven't moved back into Afghanistan yet. I kind of suspect they're biding their time because the U.S. has been trying to assassinate them for a very long time. They're very high profile, high priority targets for the CIA and other, relevant groups. So
Yeah.
they're probably waiting for the U.S. to completely leave the country, leave the airport, just be completely gone before they come back out into the open.
Yeah, I pulled it up on the map here. So this is Pakistan to the south and the east of Afghanistan.
Hmm.
And Quetta is, it's a bit of a drive from the border, but yeah, it's fairly close to the border. So Kandahar would be the city in Afghanistan closest to it. And then Kabul is north and east of that location.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's not far.
Mm-hmm.
So the Pakistanis have definitely had a close relationship with the Taliban over the years. Uh, what is the diplomatic status of Pakistan with the U.S. and other regional powers? Well, relations between the U.S. and Pakistan are not great for obvious reasons. The U.S. kind of cajoled Pakistan into doing more about the Taliban over time, but they never did. They were happy to fight the Pakistani Taliban, but the Afghan Taliban they largely let alone. And as you can see, they operated pretty openly from Pakistani territory. So there was an obvious dichotomy of how the different kinds of Taliban were treated.
Why are they
So,
happy to fight against the Pakistan Taliban but not the Afghan one?
well, the Pakistani Taliban is more like a Pashtun nationalist organization, relatively speaking.
Hmm.
It's also an Islamist terrorist organization. So that group threatens the Pakistani state explicitly and perpetrated a number of attacks on the Pakistani army, among other groups. And the Pakistani state doesn't like that. If you want to be a terrorist, you have to be a terrorist outside of Pakistan, not inside of Pakistan. So they went to the mat to try to get them under control, and they dispatched the Pakistani army and committed a not inconsiderable amount of violence in the northwest frontier province to get that group under control. And they haven't really been a big deal in northwestern Pakistan for a while. There was a period like around 2008 to 2012 or so when they were pretty significant, and they actually threatened U.S. supply lines at one point. They were attacking U.S. logistics trucks that were coming through the Khyber Pass. But they were able to get that under control, and it hasn't really been a major part of the news cycle ever since. Not in the past 5, 7 years or so, at least not to my recollection. But the Afghan Taliban, in contrast, not only don't threaten the Pakistani state, they're pursuing the Pakistani state's interests, which is to ensure a friendly government in Kabul. So that's why there was a difference in treatment there. Two different groups with two different objectives.
Mm-hmm. One of them is in your yard. The other one is not as well.
Yeah.
Oh, pronunciation correction. Cajoled.
Oh,
Strong
is it
J.
cajoled?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh man.
A lot of times the J is soft and it would be cajold, but it's cajoled.
All right. Thank you for the correction. I'll have to rewrite my vocabulary again. And that's always a pain. The longer you mispronounce the word, the harder it is to correct.
Cajoled.
Yeah, cajoled.
The English is weird. I don't blame
It
you.
is at that. But yeah, Pakistan and the U.S. are not on great terms. I think the U.S. has cut off Pakistan from military aid, which it had provided for a very long time, and that was partly as punishment for, gosh, a lot of things. I think the main one was that the Pakistanis cut off U.S. access to the Khyber Pass at one point. I think that was in response to some drone killings or there's just a number of thorny problems in the relationship. And eventually, the U.S. government just cut them off from military aid to try to encourage better behavior. And that, of course, never happened. And so the principal point of leverage for the U.S. since then has mostly been more economic. And there's been kind of the threat of economic sanctions over quote unquote support for terrorism that have been kind of floating around since then, but the hammer never really quite drops. They basically try to give the Pakistani state time to improve, and then when they don't, they start issuing threats again. So it's kind of the U.S. has been asymptotically approaching the point of sanctions basically over the past 5 years. implicitly threatening them over their ties to the Taliban and other terrorist groups. I suspect there's some reluctance on the part of Washington to do that because Pakistan's government is not super stable. It's more stable than it used to be, but I think there's a fear that if you put significant economic pressure on Pakistan, then maybe some of the more extreme elements within Pakistani society would come to power. And at that point, you would have basically Pakistan Taliban uh, 2.0, if you like, coming to power in a country that has access to nuclear weapons, which nobody wants. So destabilizing Pakistan in any way comes with the implicit threat of loose nukes. And that's generally enough, I think, to curb significant foreign pressure of Pakistan. Yeah, another reason the US didn't put a lot of pressure on Pakistan is because it did want to maintain the supply chain that went through Pakistani territory. That was one of the downsides of having that 20-year presence in a state surrounded by countries that didn't want us there. We had to cut some side deals with some of those countries, and one of the prices we had to pay as a result is that one of the main countries supporting the Taliban could not be punished to the degree that we probably needed to in order to try to get them to stop supporting the Taliban. That was just the price we paid for logistics. There was some effort to diversify. I remember that there was an agreement to allow some supplies, not a full range of supplies, but some supplies would go through Russia, actually. They would come in through the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and then they would come in down some of the Central Asian republics, basically, and then into Afghanistan. So that was another sort of major source of supplies. But I don't know that it was ever enough to really make Pakistan replaceable, such that we could just kind of give up on that supply route, at least as I understood it. So now that we're out of Pakistan, or Afghanistan rather, now that we're out of Afghanistan, we actually now have a lot more leverage over Pakistan than we did before. And it'll be interesting to see what the US just does with that. The Pakistanis may be delighted right now that they have their strategic depth. They have control, de facto control anyway, over Afghanistan again, but the cost may be that the superpower de jure starts using its power in ways that it hasn't been able to for the past 20 years. And it may not be in ways that are very beneficial to Pakistan, especially if the Pakistanis support the Taliban if the Taliban commit atrocities. We mentioned before that it's not entirely clear if they'll do that. And but if they do start committing atrocities, if the radical element of the Taliban does come to power and is in charge, it's not just the Taliban in Afghanistan that are going to come under international opprobrium and pressure. It's also going to be Pakistan, since they're the main backers of the Taliban. And Pakistan's economy is not the best. It's not super stable. They've made gains over time, but they're still pretty import dependent on a lot of goods and services. So the US could definitely make that very uncomfortable for them if it wanted to. So that's
Sanctions,
something
dude.
else to watch. Hmm?
Sanctions, dude. It hurts.
Yeah.
It's not a direct military play against you, but if it makes all your stuff more expensive, that's still applying pressure.
Yeah, and it's not just that it makes stuff more expensive, it also makes your patronage network more expensive. Because, Pakistan, like a lot of countries in the region, has a political culture that is heavily dependent on patronage. And, if the businesses that you are extracting value from in order to maintain your patronage network collapse, that just gets harder. So at that point, you either have to turn to violence and maintain a smaller patronage network predicated on fear, or you have to start engaging in some pretty serious concessions in which you give up power to this, that, or the other group to maintain their loyalty. Neither one of those prospects is going to be appealing to the Pakistani elite. So I suspect that they'll be pretty wary about doing anything that aggravates the US too much in future. So ironically, the Pakistanis may actually behave better now that they're out of Afghanistan. But we'll see. That's kind of speculation on my part. Now, the question did ask also what the diplomatic status of Pakistan was with other regional powers. I don't know how many people listening kind of know about Pakistan's foreign relations, but for those not in the know, Pakistan's strongest foreign ally is actually China, and the Pakistanis are quite pleased with the relationship because it's what they call an all-weather relationship. It really doesn't matter what happens in either country. both governments are always willing to work with each other. It's very different to the relationship Pakistan has had with the U.S. government, which tends to be a lot more mercenary and finicky. The U.S. was willing to work with the Pakistanis during the Cold War, especially early in the Cold War. But then the Pakistanis were very upset when the U.S. did not come and defend them during the Bangladeshi War of Independence, when India basically invaded half of Pakistan and broke it off into an independent country. So you would think that would warrant the implementation of the Mutual Defense Treaty that Pakistan had with the United States. That's kind of what mutual defense treaties are for, but as was, the U.S. was not in the least bit interested in going to war with India, so we kind of punted on that one, which Islamabad did not like. So relations were kind of bad after that for a while, and then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and all of a sudden the U.S. was very interested in working with the Pakistanis again. So then the relationship revived a bit for a while. And then it tanked again when the Pakistanis started messing around with nuclear weapons. And then suddenly it revived again when the war on terror became a central tenet of American foreign policy. And now the relationship is on the rocks again because of, as the US would perceive it, insufficient cooperation in Afghanistan. So as you can see, it's been a very up and down relationship over time. But Pakistan's relationship with China has never been so rocky. It's been very steady over time. So China's attitude basically towards Pakistan is that whatever Pakistan wants to do in its backyard is Pakistan's business. They don't really give a shit. China's big concern is terrorism. That's what they don't want. They've already got something of an issue in their main Muslim Western province in Xinjiang. I'm sure everybody has heard about that issue by now. How they're managing that is certainly open to criticism, but one of the problems that their technique to deal with the problem is that it invites a lot of criticism from radical jihadis in the region. So certainly the Taliban could go out of their way to support Uyghur terrorists if they wanted to. They've certainly got plenty of reasons to. But thus far, it's not apparent. That's kind of the theme of the day. We don't know. We don't know if the Taliban are going to want to aggravate China any more than they're going to aggravate any of their other neighbors in the region by supporting terrorism. So long as they don't, Beijing is probably going to be pretty chill about the Taliban, and they're probably just going to leave it to the Pakistani government to manage it how they want. Now, if the Taliban do start causing problems in Xinjiang, that's a different story. In that case, the Chinese will probably start putting a lot of pressure on Pakistan to do something about it. Just what, who knows, but they'll definitely try to do that. So all of that just depends on how ambitious the Taliban are in terms of regional affairs. That remains to be seen. But Pakistan's relationship with China in general, outside of the Taliban, is very strong. So certainly they'll be willing to work together pretty tightly on whatever kind of project Pakistan has envisioned for Afghanistan going forward. Pakistan's relations with other countries aren't really that important. They don't really have a strong relationship with Iran. There's kind of a mutual suspicion there because of the Baluchistan issue. Baluchistan is a province, well, the ethnic Baluch people, let's say, occupy territory that encompasses territory in both Pakistan and Iran. And the Pakistanis kind of have a sneaking suspicion that maybe the Iranians are supporting some of the Baluchi separatists in southwestern Pakistan. That's sort of one of the unreported low-intensity conflicts of the world. The Pakistanis don't allow a lot of international media into Baluchistan. And the rebels aren't really powerful enough to do anything too dramatic, like take a city or anything like that. It's mostly hit-and-run attacks, terrorist attacks, that kind of thing. So there's some low level of tension between Pakistan and Iran for that. But beyond that, they don't really seem to deal much with each other, or at least not from what I've seen. So Pakistan's relations with the Russia are kind of meh. The Russians have been trying to improve ties, basically to try to fill the diplomatic vacuum left by the U.S. The U.S. had sold a lot of equipment to the Pakistanis. The Russians would be quite happy to pick up the market share if they could. They're always looking for buyers for their military equipment, since that's one of the major pillars of their industry, the defense establishment. But beyond that, I don't think they have any deeper relations, at least not yet. Although I'm sure Moscow will be very eager to work with Islamabad diplomatically as far as the Taliban goes. Again, Moscow and Tehran are both very concerned about potential Taliban support for terrorists, so I suspect there will be increased engagement between Pakistan and these other countries in the region just based on that. But beyond that, I don't think there's been a lot of pre-existing diplomatic action between them. I think Pakistan is pretty laser focused on India and then on Afghanistan, and that's about it. Well, also China, trying to build economic relations with them and get out of that relationship what they can, but not necessarily much of a strategic relationship there per se, especially since they started defaulting on their loans,
Oh.
which you kind of knew had to happen, right? The Pakistani economy just isn't the strongest, so all of the investments China made in Pakistan have not really come to fruition yet, and they're starting to have trouble paying those loans, and so it kind of puts the Chinese government in an awkward position. I mean, do you cut them off, but then maybe lose some of your diplomatic leverage with a strategically located ally? Again, China wants to build infrastructure that'll allow them access to the Indian Ocean without having to go through the Straits of Malacca. And if they can build Gwadar Port in Pakistan and build pipelines and roads and whatnot to link the port in Pakistan that they're building with Western China and infrastructure in Western China, that would make it a lot easier to get around the Straits of Malacca like that. But as is, a lot of those projects are kind of in development hell. They're sort of stuck at various stages. There's a lot of corruption. It's just, there's a lot of problems there. But whatever leverage you might have, you lose if you just cut them off from all of the loans. And then, you're definitely not getting paid back. So it's definitely a strategic dilemma for Beijing. I suspect they'll try to maintain the relationship as best they can, but it's getting awkward for them. They're coming up against the fact that satellite states rarely are very good satellites, especially when they have a lot of autonomy. The best satellite states are the ones you directly control, like the Soviets did in Eastern Europe. But the Chinese don't have nearly that much control over Pakistan. And that's, the limits of economic influence are being met there. But yeah, Pakistan is mostly focused on India and Afghanistan and to a lesser degree China. So their diplomatic relations largely reflect that, at least as I understand them. And let's see. Abyss Kuda asked, what happened to all the Afghan security forces? Why did they crumble? Where are they now?
We discussed that some last time.
Yeah, we touched on that last time. Uh, they either joined the Taliban or they just quit for the most part. The commandos, I think, are largely going to Panjshir Valley. Either that or trying to get out of the country entirely. But other than that, yeah, most of the security forces saw no particular interest in continuing on in a hopeless battle. It was clear the local militias, the paramilitaries, the police, all the auxiliary forces that might have helped them out all just kind of bled away. They either made deals with the Taliban or just ran. So the Afghan military, which actually did want to fight, it wasn't the most effective institution, but a lot of them actually were willing to fight. But a lot of them on the eve of battle were just told to stand down by leadership that cut deals with the Taliban. And
I'm just saying,
yeah. And those that did want to fight just ended up cut off from supplies, reinforcement. I mean, it was a clusterfuck. Tactically and strategically at every level, there was just no way that it was going to work. And morale was already really low. When the Trump administration signed the peace deal at Doha, that kind of sent the signal that the U.S. had one foot out the door and that they weren't going to support them going forward. The evacuation of Bagram Air Base sent the same signal. And the U.S. just sent a lot of signals over the past year that it was just leaving, regardless of the circumstances. And that really hit morale in the ANA pretty hard. And it's not like it was ever great to begin with. So yeah, they're just kind of scattered to the four winds at this point. Is there any word of humanitarian organizations remaining behind in Afghanistan? Kind of already addressed this. Yeah. A lot of them are going to stick it out and just kind of see how things pan out. It's not really clear, again, how the Taliban are going to govern. So it's not clear if they're just going to kick out all the foreign aid people or if they're going to allow them to stay, but conditionally, or if they'll just let them stay outright. So everybody's kind of wait and see mode on that. It's not inevitable that they'll kick them out. Like I mentioned earlier, they may let them stay basically in exchange for the foreign aid that comes in as a result. Uh, so that's a possible outcome, but it's just not clear right now if that's going to happen. Is this considered a lost war, or did we succeed in the assassination of bin Laden? That's a subjective question. It really depends on how you want to judge the conflict. I mean, if you judge it purely in terms of counterterrorism, fairly successful. I mean, the Al Qaeda was dispersed and pushed out of Afghanistan. The Taliban also were pushed out of Afghanistan for a while. Uh, hasn't really been terrorist attacks targeting the West that originated in one way or the other from Afghanistan. So you could kind of call that a win, although you could just as easily argue that they were just planned elsewhere. There's lots of failed states around the world. But yeah, in general, the United States did succeed in denying Afghanistan to extremist elements for the most part. It'll certainly be much easier for them to operate now that we've pulled out. So, in that sense, kind of a loss.
It was like a short and medium term victory then, where you're able to prevent them from operating in that location as long as you're there, but as soon as you leave, they'll come right back.
Yeah, and really that's one of the arguments for why it was just kind of unrealistic to expect
Mm-hmm.
a permanent presence to do that. I mean, one of the criticisms I've read from some of the national security commentary, if that's a word, some of the national security commentary I've read is that, whatever else the United States might have done right or wrong in the country, it would have been the best for us to maintain some presence in country in order to continue counter-terror operations. But I don't think that was ever really realistic. And I think that's partly institutional bias that grew out of the aftermath of 9/11. There was just a very strong political demand to fight terror after 9/11 for obvious reasons. But I don't think making counterterrorism a major pillar of American foreign policy was ever a good idea. Because that's just a very amorphous, ambiguous goal. Like, you can't ever really get rid of terrorism. You can mitigate it. But by prioritizing it above all else, you were going to make some very poor trade-offs. One of the reasons I suspect that a lot of people in the Afghan establishment, the Afghan government and Afghan military, thought that the U.S. would never leave was specifically because we were mostly focused on counterterrorism. That was pretty much the main objective for the U.S. in country, above and beyond, development or defeating the Taliban and whatnot. And so long as that was our main objective, nothing else really mattered. And if nothing else really matters, then why would we leave? So that may have been the rationale on the part of the Afghan officials. There was just there was a weak reason for us to kind of stay permanently. It made sense if that is a main priority, strategically speaking. If you do just want to prioritize counterterror above all else, then yeah, a permanent presence makes sense. But that was not politically feasible, and obviously, it wasn't managed sufficiently well to maintain the presence over the long term. You would have had to have made a more stable, legitimate Afghan government to do that, and that wasn't happening. So it just wasn't ever realistic in Afghanistan, and I don't think it's realistic as a major foreign policy goal in general. Just the trade-offs you have to make aren't really worth making, I think. I'm not saying that we should just tolerate terrorist attacks on the US and just let people plan them and whatnot. But I think the risk reward should probably be shifted more towards risk. Maybe that's not the best phrasing, not risk reward, but the balance between prevention and accepting, the risk of terrorism.
Well, one thing that we discussed, I think, maybe a few years back at this point, is the difference between counterterrorism and counterinsurgency.
Yeah.
Where counterinsurgency is when you put a whole bunch of boots on the ground and occupy the area with a bunch of more standard infantry and equipment and all that, and you stay there for a while. Whereas counterterrorism would be going in and taking a few clear objectives with a very small and elite team. So the U.S. going and getting bin Laden and killing him would have been an example of counterterrorism. The war in Iraq would be an example of counterinsurgency. Obviously, there's probably some counterterrorism plays in there, but I think what you're saying is more so proportionate projection of power, where you're not going for a full-scale military campaign in a region because someone did a terrorist attack at some point. The keys would be figuring out how to identify that they're brewing up a plot and then how to stop it in the setup. That would be the cheapest way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cheaper and it's more sustainable. I've read that the US is definitely still going to do counter-terror in Afghanistan and Central Asia. It's just going to be harder now because we don't have the Afghan intelligence agency to work with. We don't have intelligence agents on the ground in Afghanistan. We don't have the same assets that we had when Afghanistan was still, either allied with the US or a US puppet, depending on your perspective. So that being the case, it's going to be harder, but it's also going to be more sustainable now. Like you don't have to worry about the legitimacy of the government or any of that jazz. However limited the ability the U.S. has to counter terror now in the region, it's going to be consistent now, at least going forward. So, whether or not we lost the war or not, debatable. I think obviously the intuitive answer is going to be that we lost since the government we were trying to set up collapsed, and we're going to have a harder time with counterterrorism now. So, all of that suggests pretty obvious loss, and probably that's the right answer. But I think in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big a strategic defeat. Because again, terrorism is not like an existential threat for the United States. If there was another major terrorist attack, the principal problem would probably be political, because American partisan politics is such that any kind of major event, terrorist or otherwise, is going to be turned into another wedge issue, unfortunately. So that's probably the bigger danger in the long run. I guess it's possible there could be like another major terrorist attack that kills just thousands of people, but I'm a little skeptical at this point. I don't think you could do another 9/11 easily because there's already, airlines have defense mechanisms for that. They've got locked doors to cockpits, they've got air marshals, there's all these rule changes that are specifically designed to make that difficult. So if you wanted to do another 9/11 style attack or at least something of the same scale, you'd have to think of something else. And it would be pretty hard. I suspect more likely is that they'll do some of the small time stuff. That's the trendy thing in terrorist circles now. You do random acts of violence that kill random people rather than the big acts of destruction where you blow up a building or something like that. The little acts of violence where you just open up on a random crowd with a small arms weapon. You don't get as many people, but you probably scare people more. And so that's why I think that shift has happened. Part of it is capacity, just not having as many resources, but I don't think it really matters that much to terrorists. You can look at France for an example of that. France has been hit with a whole bunch of relatively minor terrorist attacks, but they've completely roiled French politics over time. So it's certainly been impactful. But yeah, strategically speaking, though, it's not that big of a defeat because terrorism isn't that big of a threat to the United States. And overall, America's core interests are still protected. We still have a strong position in East Asia. We still have a strong position in Europe, especially Western Europe. We've still got the Western Hemisphere pretty thoroughly locked down. If you don't think so, you can talk to people in Venezuela about that. They'll be happy to elaborate on the subject. So overall, we're still in a pretty good strategic position. Central Asia was always an awkward fit. Like I was talking earlier, just the fact that we were there at all was just a minor strategic miracle, just a testament to the sheer strength of American power in the world, that we could just be in the middle of a region where nobody wanted us there for 20 years and just kind of do what we wanted. So getting out of there isn't great, especially under the circumstances, but overall, we're probably better off for it. We don't have to make as many trade-offs with Pakistan or Russia or Iran for that matter. It frees up resources we can use in other parts of the world. And it largely pushes the problem of terrorism in Afghanistan to regional actors who are probably going to be better able at managing it than we were. And they'll certainly have more of an incentive to anyway. So it's a loss probably in Afghanistan, but it's not a total strategic catastrophe either, like some people in the news have been trying to make it out to be.
There's a quick question that jumps out in the chat. What is the balance of blame? Trump versus Biden versus Obama versus Bush? And
it was a team. Oh, go ahead.
To break it down for one step real quick, there's a really common thing that people are doing in the chat today, which is you focus on the name of the executive like they're the boss of the entire US government and they decide everything and they have responsibility for everything. There are a lot of separations of powers where you have the houses of Congress, which both have a substantial amount of power, and they can check the president's power, and then you have the judicial branch as well, where they decide what is or is not fitting with the Constitution. They have a good bit of power, and they have checks on the other branches as well. So be aware that whenever you're invoking the name of a president and talking about blame and this and that they have a 4 to 8 year term, and then they pass it to someone else. And because of that, the systems around them have existed for longer than they have. So a lot of it is about the momentum of the government as a whole, where it's going, and then how can the president push for leadership in some given direction. But yeah, I think you're going to break it down in terms of what each president's tenure was like. But yeah, you can't just like look at a president and say that everything in that presidency was the will of that person. It's a pretty big system of government.
Yeah, and not everything that happens is within your power as president to control or stop.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are some things that are just exogenous. They just kind of happen. As far as how the blame should be distributed, I mean, it really was a team effort across the whole 20 years of the conflict, you know. Going back to Bush, the problem is that he took the focus off Afghanistan and put a lot more focus on Iraq. And that, of course, was a running sore in American foreign policy for a number of years. If that hadn't happened, would Afghanistan have turned out the same way anyway? You could make that argument. It's tough to say. It's one of those impossible counterfactuals of history at this point. You know, who knows? Certainly, I think if not for Iraq, the US would have been relatively more focused on Afghanistan, but the Pakistanis still would have been helping out the Taliban, and the Taliban would have still been working on building up networks within Afghanistan that would eventually flower into the government beating force that we see today. So maybe it wouldn't have made a difference, but it certainly would have helped anyway. So the Bush administration definitely didn't help in that regard. And also, you could blame the Bush administration for being too ambitious. You could say that invading Afghanistan and getting rid of the Taliban in order to get rid of Al-Qaeda was necessary because the Taliban were not willing to turn on Al-Qaeda. So, you know, I think everybody agrees that was an okay move. But the problem then is that we stayed on and tried to build a modern state, and that was, in retrospect, probably way too ambitious. So in that sense, you could blame the Bush administration for not having realistic goals for the U.S. mission in Afghanistan. To be fair, as somebody who was around back then, albeit very young, I'm pretty sure if the Bush administration had done anything else but try to set up a modern state in Afghanistan, people would have shit a brick. Because, I think today people define partisanship largely in more recent terms. You know, partisanship in U.S. politics has never been greater than, in the past 5 years or so. But partisanship was not great back in the Bush years either. I think anybody who lived through it can remember just how much a lot of people hated Bush. So if anybody in the Bush administration had so much as suggested that the Afghans were somehow not capable of democracy or couldn't handle a modern state or that the U.S. should just prop up warlords, they would have been skewered, absolutely, for suggesting it. They probably would have been called racist for even mentioning it.
One of the factors to kind of go back to 9/11 would be the public sentiment was very much in the vein of we need to do something about this. Mm-hmm. And I believe it was voted on by Congress whether or not we should go to the Middle East, right? And they were in favor of it. And it was a bipartisan thing, too. It wasn't just like, well, the Republicans had the House and the legislature, so only they voted for it. I think Biden was a senator at that point or a representative.
Oh, yeah, everybody voted for it.
Too. Yeah.
The war was very popular. And over the course of the war in Afghanistan, in the early months when we were pushing out the Taliban, it was popular. And for some months after, it was popular. But then after that, the question arose of, what do we do now? Mm-hmm. And that's when the issue started up. And that's also roughly when the government started prepping people for the invasion of Iraq. That didn't start up too much long after. That didn't start up long after. So partisanship returned pretty quickly after 9/11. There was only maybe like a year or maybe a year and a half where there was like solid, reliable support for the president. But after that, it was kind of business as usual. And there was even during the war, there was suspicion of U.S. motives. Like, what is our long-term plans for Afghanistan? Are we really going to set up a liberal democracy, or are we just going to set up a puppet government that we can use to further our own ends in the region? Uh, to be fair, the two are not mutually exclusive, but yeah, that was definitely a concern at the time. So I don't know that the Bush administration really realistically had an option of doing anything other than trying to do what would have been considered at the time as quote unquote the right thing. Uh, Everybody kind of wanted what was best for Afghanistan, and so it was just sort of assumed implicitly that that would entail creating a modern state and providing something resembling modernity to the Afghans. We have the benefit of hindsight now to kind of argue otherwise, but that wasn't really in doubt at the time. But with the benefit of hindsight, we can still blame Bush for that. So that's another way that we could blame the Bush administration. Now, after the Bush administration was the Obama administration, and the criticism there is that they were never really genuine about wanting to kind of finish the war. There was some debate about whether the US should double down on Afghanistan or whether we should get out. Vice President at the time, Biden, was kind of known for wanting to get out. But Obama ultimately chose kind of a middle path that was probably the worst of both worlds. He didn't want to just pull out because then he would have been criticized politically for just leaving Afghans to their fate. And, all those US soldiers who died would die for nothing. And there would have been a lot of heat. But on the other hand, he obviously didn't want to just stay. One of the reasons he was elected was to try to end the so-called forever wars. So he ultimately went with a surge. That was sort of what the U.S. did in Iraq around 2008. We flooded in U.S. troops in the hope that we could do enough damage to the insurgency that they would be crippled or at least significantly weakened, in the hopes that that would create enough space, politically speaking, in the country for some kind of peace deal or peace negotiation to play out. So that's kind of what the Obama administration wanted to do with the Afghan surge. And that played out over several years. And then over that course of the surge, they didn't really have to think about it because they could just say, well, let's let the surge work. Let's let it kind of work its way out and see what happens. And so the Obama administration kind of pushed it under the rug. It was just a problem for later. So they weren't really serious about ending the conflict. They just kind of wanted to let somebody else deal with it, shunted aside. So a certain amount of disingenuousness on the part of the Obama administration in dealing with the conflict is probably the principal criticism there. You could also say that they moved away from counterinsurgency and focused more on counterterrorism, and then that was a problem. But that's a thorny discussion. That was a big deal at the time. There was a lot of Coinistas in the U.S. military back in the day. Early in the global war on terror, counterinsurgency was very popular in the U.S. military. It was seen as like the main way that we would fight terrorism and kind of save and prop up these states that we were trying to create in Afghanistan and Iraq. But it also seemed clear to a lot of critics of that policy, in and out of the military, that it was a fool's errand and that, counterinsurgency could not work in the long run. It just wasn't sustainable without a political solution of some kind.
Why was counterinsurgency cool? Is it just that it's like you're loud, you're visible, you're there, you're sending in the troops? It's like a hoorah thing, or what?
Well, I mean,
because it's more expensive.
The states we were trying to prop up were under direct threat, so it was seen as pretty necessary. It just wasn't really viable early in those conflicts to just leave. We needed to kind of prop up the states. And so that inherently meant that we were going to have to do some counterinsurgency in the short term, at least. But the counterinsurgency experts were trying to kind of create more of a long-term situation. And to be fair, counterinsurgency experts were happy to point out that a political settlement would be necessary in the long term, but it really didn't seem like the U.S. military was doing that. And so a lot of people were suspicious that there was mission creep in the U.S. military missions, and that they were basically just expanding the mission indefinitely and trying to hide bad news such that there would never really be a point when the war could reach a point where the U.S. could realistically pull out. And that's basically what happened in Vietnam. So it's not like there wasn't precedent. That's kind of what people were thinking of. The U.S. as an institute, the U.S. military as an institution can do some great things. But if you ask it to do some impossible shit, then you're going to get weird results. So asking the U.S. military to create a new state and reform a society and eliminate all terrorism, none of that was ever realistic. And when you ask somebody to do the impossible, you're asking them to lie to you. And so the U.S. military was put in this awkward position where it basically had to lie in order to make the mission look good. They didn't want to just leave. They didn't want to come out and say, oh, this whole thing is a clusterfuck and it's not working, because that's bad news for the government, for one. It's bad political press, but it's also bad for the government that you're trying to prop up because it makes them look illegitimate. PR is a part of the mission too. It's not just going out and killing bad guys. You also want to build up your allies with positive PR. And, unfortunately, one of the lessons the U.S. military learned from Vietnam is that the U.S. media is a problem more than an ally. Because the U.S. media does not always just parrot what you want them to say. They'll go and ask uncomfortable questions. They'll do exposés that make your allies look good. And, some of that is useful in so much as it reveals problems. But it's also problematic in so much as it's undermining the authority of your government, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Vietnam, whatever. So from a U.S. military perspective, the U.S. media can do more harm than good. And so they were pretty focused on restricting access to the theater. It was pretty rare for U.S. media people to go in without some kind of military chaperone. And so as a result, the U.S. public didn't get a full picture of the war, basically. Unfortunately for the U.S. military, the public didn't really care that much about Afghanistan over the 20 years we were there, so it didn't end up being a problem. But the U.S. military as an institution, basically, has become very good at misrepresenting things like this. And again, that's not entirely their fault. That's partly just because the mission they were giving was just totally unrealistic. But if the politicians say that they're not going to accept negative feedback and then they're not going to change the mission no matter what, there's not much you can do. So you're pretty much stuck with the implementation of a bad policy. So I don't entirely blame the U.S. military for doing what they did, but that was definitely part of the problem. I'm not sure how I got onto that. Let's see. So the next question was, what's going on with the Northern Alliance resistance? It doesn't really exist right now. I mean, the core of the Northern Alliance was kind of watered down over the course of the past 20 years. That was just a part of the state building project. We didn't want warlords to be like the main political actors, so we kind of made them disarm. But they still ended up being major political actors. They just didn't have militias and whatnot, or at least they didn't have them obviously. They weren't out in the open. So that kind of watered down the Northern Alliance over time to the point where they weren't really ready for the collapse of the government in the past month or two. If they'd been armed, then they probably would have fought. But as was, they were caught off guard just like everybody else was. From what I've read, even the Taliban were surprised by how fast the government collapsed. It seems that they were not expecting that. They were just kind of pushing to see how much ground they could gain, and they ended up gaining all of it. So they're playing catch up, kind of like everybody else is at this point, it seems. We talked about Panjshir Valley and how the Masood, the warlord Masood, or more accurately, the son of the warlord Masood, is trying to set up some kind of resistance in Panjshir Valley, but it's not really clear if it's going to be substantive. If they get foreign support, then maybe, but I don't think they're going to get it. I don't think foreign support looks likely. The West already tried foreign support in Afghanistan, and obviously it hasn't worked. So I don't think there's a lot of stomach for it at this point. Other countries like Russia and China are not going to be interested. They're going to be focused on influencing Afghanistan by way of Pakistan, which basically de facto runs Afghanistan at this point through the Taliban. Although it's debatable how much direct control they really have. That's another open question we'll be watching for over the next couple months. But yeah, the Northern Alliance resistance is not really a factor at this point. And keep in mind what I said earlier, the Taliban have been working very hard to try to attract to try to attract people from ethnic minorities into their movement or into their sort of umbrella coalition, if you like. And they've been relatively successful at that. So a lot of the northern territories that the Northern Alliance was based in actually have relatively strong Taliban elements now that they didn't have 20 years ago. So it's not going to be as simple as just restarting the old gang. There's political difficulties now that are going to make that much harder for them. Now, if you're wondering what happened to some of the old warlords that had been in the government but that made deals with the Taliban instead of fighting, at this point, they're kind of being allowed to run their own little fiefdoms like they were, before the Taliban took over. Whether or not the Taliban allows them to continue doing that, or if the warlords themselves turn on the Taliban later when they feel they're stronger, who's to say? All of that is speculation. At this point, though, the Taliban are very much in charge, and the warlords don't seem to be making too much trouble for them. So it remains to be seen how that'll pan itself out. Let's see, when we say counterinsurgency, what kind of tactics are those referring to? So counterinsurgency basically refers to the use of military force to fight insurgents. And generally when the US talks about it, they're talking about using a foreign military to fight a local indigenous insurgency. In the case of Iraq, that meant using the US Army or Marine Corps, basically the whole US military, in order to fight Iraqi insurgents of one sort or another. And, it was just expected that that would be a long-term problem, and that even if we were able to defeat the insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, that we would just end up having to do it again later. So there was a lot of people in the US military who wanted to perfect the art of counterinsurgency. But there was a lot of critics, again, that didn't think that was ever going to be viable, and that would make more sense to either focus on a political solution or to pull the US military out and focus on something like counterinsurgency. That's actually what happened with the Obama administration. Actually, that's what I was talking about before, wasn't it? What?
You mean pull out and do counterterrorism instead of counterinsurgency?
Yeah. Actually, now that's what we were talking about. We were talking about how to distribute blame amongst the different presidents, and we were talking about the Obama administration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my memory isn't the best, so I apologize. So counterinsurgency was sort of the main thing. That was the big trendy thing in the US military for a long time. But a lot of people were very critical of that, and they thought it would be better if the US just pulled the US military out and focused on projecting force using other means. And so that's where the emphasis on counterterrorism came for. So for a while, there was a big argument in the Obama administration between the counterinsurgency proponents and the counterterrorism proponents. And because the Obama administration, or more specifically President Obama, really wanted to reduce the US military presence in these countries, because that's part of why he'd been elected, people were very skeptical of the wars even then. Ultimately, he decided to go with the counter-terror approach. And so the US forces were drawn down over time in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And the emphasis shift much more to intelligence agencies and clandestine activity, as well as providing indirect support like logistical support, intelligence support, and air support, none of which required ground troops per se. So that was a big shift that happened during the Obama administration. But you could criticize him for doing that, because you could argue that it would have been better just to maintain those ground troops there for longer, and maybe they could have made a difference. I don't think very many people would make that argument. I think everybody is pretty skeptical of deploying US forces to nation build at this point. But that was a debate at the time, so you could criticize him for doing that, or at least not doing it in the best way. So let's see, that's the Bush administration for getting us in the first place and being too ambitious. You could criticize the Obama administration for being disingenuous about wanting to end the conflict, and for maybe shifting strategy to counterterrorism instead of counterinsurgency. So that brings us to the Trump administration. The obvious thing you could blame the Trump administration for was prioritizing a peace deal above all else. They very easily could have delayed the pullout. They could have asked for a later deadline. There wouldn't have been a whole lot the Taliban could do about it. But it seemed like the Trump administration wanted to make sure that they reached some kind of status quo where the Taliban were not inflicting casualties on U.S. forces. That seems to have been a priority not only for the Trump administration, but also the Biden administration. That was kind of seen as a prerequisite to the U.S. pulling out. Nobody wants the US to pull out and have it look like a humiliation where US troops are being killed and then you leave without retaliating. So they wanted to try to create that status quo where there wasn't any casualties. There were already very few US casualties by that point, because again, the US had largely drawn down by that point and support was indirect, but there were some ground troops involved, special forces, those kinds of people. So the emphasis was very much on trying to create the foundation for a later US pullout. And there wasn't really as much emphasis on ensuring that the Taliban honored their end of the deal or whatnot. Even during the Trump administration, the Taliban had started to renege on the deal. Mostly they focused on attacking the Afghan government, though, not the US military. And so as a result, that made it relatively easy for the US government to continue on with the peace deal as planned and the corresponding pullout without changing things too much. So if you want to criticize the Trump administration, that's probably the main thing you would criticize them for. Uh, so the Biden administration is obvious. You can criticize them for prioritizing the pullout over all other things. Obviously, I think one of the best criticisms I've read of the Biden administration thus far is that they didn't delay the pullout further. Because one of the things they could have done is delayed the pullout until winter. And like we talked about last time, fighting is seasonal in Afghanistan. There's fighting mostly in the spring and summer, and then during the fall and winter, fighting tampers down because it's kind of too cold to go out and fight, basically. When you're a guerrilla and you kind of just operate out in the field and live out in the wilderness or like in hamlets or whatnot, weather is a real factor. And
Do
if
you
it
want to
gets
go
too
to war
cold,
today? No, I don't. It's too cold.
yeah, that's a real thing. So one of the criticisms is that the pullout should have been delayed until winter when the Taliban would not have been conducting offensive operations or would not really have been as able to conduct offensive operations. As was, we pulled out during the fighting season, so it was much easier for the Taliban to take advantage. So that's a big criticism right there. Obviously, there wasn't enough planning for the evacuation of allies and US personnel, so that's another obvious one. We're seeing that every day. So that's an obvious one. I think those would be the two main criticisms, the evacuation and not delaying the pullout. So I would say, yeah, that's what I can come up with off the top of my head anyway. So there's plenty of blame to go around. I think the biggest common denominator is that there was just not political support for the war in the long term. In the short term, there was, get in, get the Taliban, get the Al Qaeda, there was political support in the United States for that. And that was the most successful part of the 20-year effort. But after that, US support waned very quickly. And basically, the last 10, 15 years of the war were basically the US just trying to figure out how to get out. And so that really hobbled the war effort just right there. You can't half-ass a war. There's just no way. So it's no surprise then that things didn't go our way. It was only really in the first 5 years that we were really dedicated to making things work. And after that, we were off to Iraq or we were trying to just get out for the sake of getting out or whatever. Just the strategic imperative was not strong enough to compel the American public to support the war effort. And so long as that was the case, the political will to stay wouldn't be there. And without political will, you're not going to have very good strategy. That's really one of the big problems for the US in general right now, if not over the past couple decades. There's just really not enough public support for America's global role to really sustain it in the long term. And we never had a conversation after the end of the Cold War about how to handle that. Because everybody was pretty on board with containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War, at least for the most part. But after the Cold War ended, not so much. And nobody really knew what to do with American power in the world, other than like the bare minimum of like stopping countries from invading other countries, which is kind of what we did with Kuwait and Iraq. But beyond that, not much consensus. 9/11 provided a temporary consensus for a discrete foreign policy objective, but not much else besides. The idea that the United States would just permanently fight a global war on terror was always outlandish. I think some of the hawkish officials of the Bush administration were fooling themselves as they thought that they could talk or trick the US public into doing that. It was just never going to happen. So reconciling the difference between public support and government objectives, I think, is really one of the overlapping problems that multiple administrations faced in Afghanistan, and that ultimately doomed the mission in the long term. You'll notice this isn't a problem for South Korea. Like, I don't think anybody really comes out and seriously argues, like, we don't need to be there, let's pull out of South Korea as soon as possible. It doesn't exist. And that's because there's a strong public consensus there, or at least a relatively strong consensus there. But that just never existed for Afghanistan. To a degree, you could say that's the government's fault for not building a consensus. Maybe they should have been more honest about the long-term nature of the commitment, or been more honest and forthright about the kinds of objectives the US had there, or been less ambitious in those objectives. But no government in the past 20 years ever did that. Nobody ever really tried to make that effort to the public. Instead, it was just noted that, well, it was hoped in the first 5 years that there wouldn't have to be a long-term commitment. And then after that, everybody just tried to figure out a way out. There was just no effort made to try to get the public on board. And I don't know that there even would have been a way in retrospect, just because the American public is so skeptical of overseas interventions. But yeah, I think the main lesson there is that you have to have public support one way or the other. And if you don't have it, it's not going to work. It's just not. In the long run, it's going to go bad. Like what we're seeing now in Kabul, or like what we saw with the Islamic State in Iraq. It doesn't matter if the US has a good reason to be there. If the public doesn't want it to happen, then they're either going to force you to leave or they're going to make it politically impossible to stay in the short run, such that you have to make compromises that completely fuck up the mission. So it's just not viable. So that's answering two questions. Who should get blamed for the war? Everybody. Multiple administrations did things wrong, poor strategy, bad job of getting the public on board. The public itself didn't really give a shit for a long time. It didn't do a very good job of holding the government to account. So there's some blame there as well. Yeah, there's any number of ways you could point, any number of directions you could point your finger. And then I think I also kind of addressed the question about counterinsurgency. Just conventional forces versus unconventional forces, trying to clamp down on a insurgency with conventional military forces, probably foreign, is generally what counterinsurgency refers to. And the individual tactics vary. It just depends on the conflict. Russian counterinsurgency is very different to American counterinsurgency. We tend to focus on hearts and minds here in the US. We're not very good at it, and I don't know that we've ever made it work. But when we've fought counterinsurgencies, that's been more the direction we've tried to go in. Russian counterinsurgency is much more slash and burn. They kill people until they fold. And that's kind of what they did in Chechnya, and it's been more what they've been doing in Syria. They've been pretty successful, so maybe there's something to be said for it. But those are the differences. There are different ways you can do counterinsurgency. Let's see. How much did the US influence the rise of the Taliban in the first place? Didn't we fund them as an anti-communist group back in the day? Kind of. This is something I've seen a bit on like Reddit and stuff. The Taliban did not really exist before the 1990s. So in other words, they weren't really a group during the Soviet invasion back in the 80s. They had not really been created yet. Keep in mind the Taliban were largely a Pakistani creation. Kind of. Again, they weren't like artificially created by the ISI to be their agents in Afghanistan. There is an actual legitimate, peaceful actually group called the Taliban in Pakistan. And we've actually talked about them a little bit before, years ago on here. The Taliban are basically just a peaceful Islamist group that focuses on teaching the Quran and Islam. And they were created way back in the 1860s, 1870s, something like that. And it was a direct response, actually, to the Sepoy Revolt. So for those of you who don't know your Indian history, which if you're like most people, including myself, is probably almost everybody, not a lot of Indian students, not a lot of India students, unfortunately. But one of the things that happened in the 1850s when the British were in control of India is that there was a massive revolt that encompassed most of the country. And it was mostly Bengalis and Muslims who revolted at the time. And there's reasons for it. I won't unless somebody wants to specifically talk about the Sepoy Revolt, I won't get into the details, but basically, the rebels got their asses kicked, and the British were particularly brutal about, retaliating against them. So one of the questions that was raised amongst Muslims in India after the fact, I should say amongst British India, since at that time Pakistan didn't exist. So one of the questions Muslim Indians asked themselves is, why didn't we win? How come we weren't able to succeed in this revolt? And one of the answers was that they were not coherent enough of a community and that they were not dedicated enough to Islam. And so one of the groups that cropped up after the rebellion failed was this group called the Taliban, which, Taliban is the Pashtun word for students. And so they were the students of Islam. They created some institutions to provide religious teaching and indoctrination. And again, it was mostly peaceful. They weren't teaching people to go on jihad and whatnot. It was just, here's Islam, here's how it works, be a good Muslim. Now, they continued to exist for decades, and they still exist today. They've just been around ever since. But what happened in the 80s is that some of the seminary students there at some of these religious schools broke away, and they decided to go fight in Afghanistan. And eventually, after the war ended, they started coalescing into a group of people who all had the same background in these Taliban schools, and they started calling themselves the Taliban, even though they didn't have much in common with the seminaries they came from. Again, as I understand it, the Taliban in Pakistan and the seminaries they control are actually just peaceful and they focus on religion. But in Afghanistan, the students that broke away to fight became radicalized and they started up their own version, basically, of the Taliban. And so they are the ones who have kind of been dominating Afghan politics since then. But the Taliban as an organization did not exist, I think, during the actual war against the Soviets. Some of the people who had formed the Taliban were fighters at the time with certain rebel groups, but the institution itself had not been created yet. So, yes, kind of we funded the Taliban, but not the Taliban as we think of them today. That was a different group that kind of emerged in the post-war Afghan political landscape. Yeah, keep in mind the United States did not, again, as I understand it, the US did not fund jihadis in Afghanistan who were fighting against the Soviets directly. Rather, we worked through interlocutors, specifically the ISI. They pop up again. We gave money, weapons, and supplies and whatever else to the ISI, and then the ISI went and supported, this, that, or the other jihadi group or mujahideen group or Afghan nationalist group or whomever they saw fit in order to help them fight the Soviets. So the support was kind of indirect in that sense. And I would point out that it wasn't just the United States supporting them. The US was probably the largest funder of the Mujahideen during the Afghan war in the 80s. But also, the French supported them, the British supported them. Interestingly, the Iranians supported them. Mind you, these are the Islamist Iranians under the Ayatollah in the 1980s. And also the People's Republic of China funded them. So it was a team effort. There was lots of people mad at the Soviets for invading Afghanistan, and they were all happy to provide supplies to the ISI and to the jihadis themselves. Oh, and the Saudis and the other Gulf monarchies also provided an immense amount of support, obviously. But most of that support went through the ISI, so it's not like the United States went in and created these personal relationships with hardcore jihadists and gave them weapons and training and whatnot. It was a little more indirect than that. And you can argue that's quibbling, that's technically speaking. In practice, we did support them. But technically, it wasn't the kind of support that I suspect a lot of people are imagining when they read that. It's not the direct support you might think it is. How are we doing on time?
Half hour?
Half hour. Okay. Did you see the Taliban and bumper cars?
No. I saw the Taliban in the gym. They're in the palace of the gym, like lifting weights and stuff, and they've got their phones and they're videoing and everything, and one of the guys has a rocket launcher on his shoulder, as if nothing were amiss. See bumper cars.
Yeah, I think it's midway down the list thereabouts.
Yeah. What's the thing that you do after you complete a conquest and take a capital city? Bumper cars.
As one does. Let's see. So the next, I think we had two more or a couple more questions. Do you believe Biden is leading America or being led by someone else's agenda? I think it's mostly Biden. I don't see why people don't think that Biden himself doesn't have his own agenda, his own preferences for governing, his own, objectives. It seems like, I mean, one of the criticisms during the whole pullout fiasco that we've been talking about is that Biden ignored the advice of his generals and other intelligence experts, that he wanted to push ahead with the pullout kind of regardless of the security implications. And I think that's largely him. He's been very critical of the US presence in Afghanistan for a very long time, even back when he was vice president under Obama. So that seems like something he himself really wants to do, not somebody else. So I'd say that's pretty clear-cut evidence that, at least in terms of that, he's very much doing his own thing. Uh, in terms of other areas, maybe you can make a maybe you can make a stronger argument that he's being influenced. I mean, every president is influenced by advisors to a pretty significant degree. No president is an expert of every issue, so they just inherently have to rely on experts from, this, that, or the other institution or field. But the idea that Biden is just like this mindless drone being manipulated by the Illuminati or whatnot, no, I don't buy that. I don't think he's that old. I think that's just a talking point created in American partisan politics. I don't really pay much heed to it. Certainly, there's lots of reasons to criticize the Biden administration. I'm not saying he's perfect or anything, but the idea that he's senile or that he doesn't know what he's doing, no. I mean, the pullout probably didn't know what he was doing. That's obviously a mess.
He's
I don't
been in
entirely
the
blame him.
he's been
Hmm?
in US politics for an extremely long period of time.
Yeah,
So it's not like he's just some new person who's been propped up as like, oh, okay, now we can get this guy and steer him around and
yeah,
tell him what to do. Like he's going to have his own opinions by this point, most likely, or
yeah.
at least he's going to be very rooted in the people who have been supporting him, who he's done favors for in the past, who they're all kind of interconnected and wanting to work as a bloc. And we've talked about this before, but he was voted in more so as the compromise candidate for the Democratic Party. He's not
Exactly.
the firebrand and the idealist who is trying to reinvent and change the U.S. in a more progressive capacity. He's specifically trying to shoot for the middle in a lot of these issues.
Yeah, there hasn't been a whole lot of dramatic moves on his part. I mean, he's been pretty good as far as non-dramatic policy making, in terms of negotiating the infrastructure deal and other such things. I think he's played his cards pretty well. He's definitely had some screw ups, some gaffes, but he's kind of known for that too, and that's no shock. So I don't entirely blame him for that. I just don't think that he's this sort of puppet that some people make him out to be. I don't buy it. It's entirely, I think he has his own objectives and preferences that he's, enacting.
But don't you find the conspiracy theories sexy?
No, not really.
No.
I liked conspiracy theories more when they were fringe. That's when they were fun. Back in the 90s when the X-Files and that whole sort of scene was the definition of that culture, then yeah, it was more fun. But it's gotten a little too mainstream for me, Neuro. I guess I'm a conspiracy hipster. That's
I
true.
like conspiracy theories back when they were cool. Now they're all over TikTok and Facebook, and it just bores me to tears.
Yeah, I guess that's what I am. Yeah, it's not as much fun now. It's been too co-opted by the political parties, I think. The political parties in the United States complain about misinformation and conspiracy theories, but I mean, who else in the United States propagates them more than the Republican and Democratic parties? Like both of them have PR agencies that specialize in that. That was one of the reasons I was so skeptical about all of the Russiagate stuff, Well, maybe not specifically the Russiagate stuff, but the idea that Russia or some company like Cambridge Analytica was just manipulating electoral outcomes with social media advertising and this kind of thing. I mean, they're not doing it to any greater degree than the parties we already have here. In fact, they're probably doing it much less. So I'm not concerned about it really, just because it's already such a pre-existing problem with American institutional actors. There's just so much American-made bullshit. Why worry about the foreign stuff?
We don't need theirs. We can make it ourselves.
Yeah, and we do with alacrity. So let's see. Next question. So Agent Smith shared about how the U.S. is withdrawing in the sense that it might be withdrawn as the global force against global terrorism. Is it possible that President Biden is taking the posture of minding their own business as before the World War when the U.S. tried to refrain from being involved in global conflicts as a nationalist stance, i.e., if it's not in our interest, we don't get involved? If so, what does this speak about Biden's politics? No, I don't think we're going to be isolationist. I think that the US position before 9/11 was, in so much as we had a position anyway, was basically just to maintain the status quo. So long as nobody tried to upset international trade, so long as nobody tried to close off oceanic trade routes, so long as nobody tried to invade somebody else outright, then we would probably just let things slide. We were principally just interested in maintaining global, at least relatively decent global governance. And that was about it. So after 9/11, there was this idea that we needed not only to go out and fight terrorists wherever they were to prevent them from using this, that, or the other failed state as a, location for planning attacks. We also had to reform whole societies and regions in order to make sure that states didn't fail in the first place, such that they could be vulnerable to terrorists. And that was a hugely ambitious strategic leap to make from the pre-existing position. And it was always, I think, too ambitious. Like I said earlier, I really don't think counterterrorism should be a major plank of US foreign policy. It should be a priority to a degree, but the idea that we should be focusing on that more than pursuing trade or ensuring that countries don't get strong enough to threaten the United States in one way or another, or whatever other national security priority you can think of, I think most of them trump terror. Because 9/11 was bad, and obviously we want to prevent that from ever happening again. But the idea that you need to reform whole societies to do that is just, no, I don't, it's just bad logic. It doesn't follow. It's just not sustainable, as we've seen. It's enormously expensive. The public doesn't want to do it. Whether the public says that they want the government to fight terrorism or not, or that it supports this, that, or the other war or not, ultimately the US public is just risk averse when it comes to foreign intervention and doesn't like it. That's just a basic, fundamental, revealed preference at this point. So just inherently, the idea that we were going to change the world to make it safe for democracy was bullshit. That was never going to happen. But I don't think that the alternative is isolationism. I think it's going to be more like what it was before 9/11, when we were just kind of maintaining global governance and trying to maintain that as kind of a baseline level of stability in the world. So I suspect that's more what we're going to go back to. And I think that's more what Biden has in mind. I think Biden's politics are kind of a mix of centrist baseline politics where you just don't rock the boat, but also some populist politics mixed in. We talked a little bit about this last time, but one of the things that Biden has tried to do was to incorporate some of the more popular populist political positions into his platform. So getting out of Afghanistan was definitely one of those. There's lots of people I've seen online commenting that they don't like how the U.S. is leaving. They don't like how we screwed over our allies, but they're still not mad the U.S. left. They're still happy about that. And in general, I think the Biden administration is betting that in the long run, people will be happier that the U.S. left than they were mad about how it was done. It remains to be seen if that gamble pays off, but certainly people are not upset that the U.S. is pulling out. I think most people are pretty okay with that. So I don't think that's a nationalist stance. I think that's just a populist stance. And I think that's, it's not great in a lot of ways, but I think it's necessary because if the public has some particular demand that is broadly popular and it's not met presidency after presidency, election after election, that delegitimizes the government in a dangerous way. If the government really wanted to stay in Afghanistan, they really should have done a much better job of trying to get the public on board. They did not, so it was just inevitable that we were going to leave sooner or later. And part of the reason partisanship is so bad in the US and part of the reason there's so much populism is specifically because the government bullshitted the public so much about wars like the war in Iraq or Afghanistan or even Vietnam. Vietnam was really the original sin. There was a lot of trust in American institutions before the Vietnam War, but trust has been in decline ever since. And, Iraq and Afghanistan is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in a way, at least in that regard. So, yeah, I think Biden is just a centrist politician who's trying to incorporate some of the populist politics that have been current in American politics for a while in order to try to shore up the legitimacy, not only of his administration, but the US government in general. That's roughly how I would characterize his politics at this point. There's some progressivism in there. I know some people don't like that, but he was elected by Democrats, so he kind of has to do that. That's no surprise. In the same way that Trump was elected by people on both the center right and the far right, he kind of had to do some far right stuff, so no shock. And before anybody gets mad, no, I'm not equating progressives with the far right. I'm just saying whoever votes you in are the people that you're going to be focused on in terms of policy
You
making.
gotta pander to your base.
That's just how it is. Oh, this is an interesting question. How are COVID and the religious tensions between Hinduism and Islam in India interacting? Not much. I think most of the interaction that you could point to there happened very early on. I think that would have been like spring 2020, roughly. Because what happened is that there were some early lockdowns in New Delhi, but there was a particular Muslim group. I don't remember which denomination was. It was like a particular like fringe group of one sort or another. But they met as part of like some festival or some holiday or something. I don't remember what it was. But they met during the lockdown, and it was suspected, I don't know if it was ever proven, but it was broadly suspected in India that they were responsible for the subsequent outbreak of COVID in New Delhi. So, rightly or wrongly, they got blamed for that. And that just fed into pre-existing sectarian tension in India, and that led directly to, I think, some pretty significant riots in New Delhi, if I'm remembering correctly. There was a particular Muslim part of the city that was targeted, and a whole bunch of, I think it was something like 50 people were killed in the rioting, specifically Muslims. They were specifically targeted, pulled out of their homes, beaten. It was one of the, it was a pretty ugly example of sectarianism in India. But I don't think anything like that has really happened since. I think the government kind of I think in general, focus just shifted. Well, I mean, COVID wasn't that bad in India in 2020. So after the initial outbreak, things kind of stayed under control. And so then people started focusing on other stuff. And I think the bigger problem in the aftermath of the riots was some of the police started arresting activists who were investigating the riots because there was accusations that the police were involved and that the government was involved in the riots. And so some activists were looking into that. And so some of them actually got arrested under this sort of ambiguously defined anti-terrorism law. I think that's what it was. It was like an old law that the British had passed way back in the British India. There's lots of laws like that that are still on the books in India that governments could very easily remove, but they very strategically choose not to because they like to abuse the shit out of them. So in this case, they were abusing them to arrest these activists. So in the wake of the riots, there was some focus on the suffering of the Muslim community, but since then, there's been more focus on abuse of counterterrorism laws to arrest political opponents and dissidents who were kind of looking into that riot. But COVID wasn't that bad in 2020 for India. It's much, much worse in 2021. The Delta variant in particular has been hitting hard, but even before that, they were getting smashed, just totally overwhelmed. But For whatever reason, there hasn't been that same sectarianism this time. I guess there hasn't been like a single flashpoint that you could point to, like a, obscure Muslim group in New Delhi, holding a holiday against lockdown restrictions. There hasn't been anything like that, at least to my knowledge. Or if there has, nobody has turned it into a political wedge issue in India. So I think the problem for the people who want sectarianism in India, and those people do exist, is that COVID was not really bad enough in 2020 to make it a good wedge issue. And in 2021, it's actually too bad. It's actually too destructive to be a wedge issue. People are genuinely afraid, and there's genuine discontent and, to a degree, policy chaos owing to the lack of healthcare capacity in India. If it were less scary, then you could probably turn it into a wedge issue, kind of like it was in the US. But in India, people are sufficiently scared that you can't really do it without seeming like really cold and heartless. Like, why aren't you focusing on this overriding healthcare crisis? Why are you talking about this other unrelated shit? That's kind of the attitude as I perceive it in India right now. So I don't think there's been a whole lot of religious tension stemming from COVID, or at least not a lot of interaction in that regard thus far, other than the one incident that I can recall. If I'm wrong, please do correct me, but that's my impression. What could the US have done to make the Afghanistan pullout better? Uh, I think the main thing would not, I think the main thing would have been contingency planning, because I think really that's what it was. I honestly don't think the Biden administration thought that the Afghan government would collapse as quickly as they did. I really think they thought they had more time. That makes the most sense to me anyway, to explain what's happening now. But that could have been avoided if they had done better contingency planning, even if they'd assumed that the Afghan government had like another 6 months or another year or whatever. They still could have had a contingency plan ready just in case it collapsed faster than expected. And so they could have had a plan for getting out, well, for one, embassy personnel. They could have had a plan for US citizens in the country, and they could have had a better plan for interpreters and other people who worked for the US government who would be in danger of retaliation under a Taliban regime. So all of that probably should have had pretty significant contingency planning ready to go just in case, and obviously it was not. Uh, yeah, I think that's the main thing that they could have done differently. At least that's the first thing that comes to mind anyway. Another thing that could have happened is that Congress could have moved much faster and streamlining the visa process because they'd actually been accepting visa applications from interpreters and other such people trying to get out of Afghanistan for the past year plus. Because it was pretty obvious from the time that the peace agreement, or even before the peace agreement was signed with the Taliban, when the Trump administration was negotiating it, that the US was on the way out. And so a lot of people started trying to figure out how they were going to get out of Afghanistan as early as late 2019, early 2020. So Congress really could have helped if they'd streamlined that process. Also the executive branches under Trump and Biden could have, probably done something on that count as well. And so that would have made it much easier for people to get visas and get out of the country, as was the process was very slow. There was a lot of people applying, and the bureaucratic capacity to process the claims was limited, and nobody really did anything about it quickly enough. So there was just a lot of people who were just waiting for responses on applications, basically, when Kabul fell. And so now they're having to rush their way through all these applications, and it's just not practical to expect them to get through them all. So most likely they're going to start taking people even if their application wasn't approved or passed, or they're going to start just throwing people to the wolves pretty much and rejecting anybody who doesn't have paperwork, or people who do have paperwork but who haven't been processed yet. So those are kind of your two options there, and either one is attractive. But when you're on a deadline, as the U.S. pretty much is at this point, we can't stay in Kabul airport forever. It's not going to be Guantanamo, right? So maybe a couple more weeks at most, I think we have to kind of finish the pullout, and that's not really enough time to get everybody out. I think we're getting out, what is it? It's like 15,000 a day. Yeah, it's not, I think roughly that's how many people were flying out of the airport every day, and that's just not enough. It's just not nearly enough. I don't think that even really would cover all of the US citizens. I think there's like 10 to 15,000 US citizens still in Afghanistan right now. So assuming you could get them all in one place in the airport, then hypothetically you could fly them all out in one day. But we're flying out more people than just US citizens. We're also getting, German citizens, British citizens, or people who worked with, British Army, the US Army, etc. So there's so much demand to get out, and there's just so little capacity that I just see no way for the US and, allied countries to get everybody out who needs to get out. I don't think that's going to happen. I think priority will be citizens of the US or the West, and that'll be it. Anybody else they get is just bonus. So I really don't blame people for just desperately trying to get into the airport because I can all but guarantee you some of those people are not going to make it out.
Can't you just send more planes? What's the limiting factor? Runways?
Um, Both. I mean, we've only got so many planes and there's only so much space at the airport. Another one of the criticisms I read is that if we had stayed in Bagram Air Base, we would have that capacity as well, because there's airfields there. So we could have used those and that would have significantly increased our ability to get people out. But as was, we left the base completely. And technically, it's actually under control of the Taliban right now. I guess we could, I guess we could politely ask the Taliban if we could use the base again. But I have a sneaking suspicion they're going to say no.
Someone was reading they're using some corporate airplanes now.
Wouldn't
Delta,
surprise me.
American Airlines, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I read that headline, but I didn't read the story. They were trying to get some airlines involved. Yeah, that'll work on some of the smaller airfields. Anything will help at this point. Any kind of extra capacity you can bring, it's just that many more people you can get out. And obviously, they want to get out as many as they can. Let's see. Oh, we had a follow-up question. Um, so Biden is not an isolationist, are you sure? If he is making the decision to withdraw his allies and citizens and allies from Afghanistan with his powers as commander in chief, is he not acting as a globalist leader and forcing the whole world to vacate a combat zone? Yeah, I'm very sure he's not an isolationist because he hasn't made any indication about pulling out of the Korean Peninsula or Europe or any of the other commitments the US has made around the world. It's pretty much just Afghanistan. Yeah, one of the criticisms I've read is that US credibility has been damaged, and I don't really think that's true. I think US reputation has been damaged. Obviously, the pullout is such a debacle that that's going to be a problem in terms of just perceptions of US competence, but US credibility in terms of security guarantees, not so much. Because I don't think any other American allies see themselves in Afghanistan, right? I mean, is there any American ally that is just riven by internal discord and has a massive insurgency and is just being actively destroyed from the inside out by corruption and, other such problems? I don't think there is. Not there's no treaty ally as such anyway. South Korea doesn't see Afghanistan as like reflecting their circumstances. It's just very different. So in that sense, I don't think American credibility has been dented. I don't think it's just equivalent circumstances. But yeah, I don't think he's an isolationist. If he makes the decision to withdraw with his powers, is he not acting as a globalist leader and forcing the whole world? He's not forcing the whole world to leave. I mean, hypothetically, the UK, Germany, whatnot could stay if they wanted to. Their problem is that they're just so dependent on US logistics that they can't realistically do that. Yeah, Europeans are pretty upset with the Biden administration right now because he didn't actually really tell them that the US was leaving. He just kind of expected them to follow our lead. So they kind of are wishing that they had been more consulted earlier in the process rather than having to kind of find out about it later after the fact. But I don't know that it would have mattered either. I don't think that they were going to change Biden's mind about it. So I don't think it just really would have made a big difference. But it would have helped them out a little in terms of being a little better prepared for everything that's happening, at least marginally so, at least.
Correction reminder: Ukraine, not the Ukraine.
Oh, I said it again, didn't I?
Crap.
That Soviet propaganda, man, I'm telling you, it gets in your brain.
You watch too many Cold War documentaries.
I guess so. I guess so. Gets in your head, man. I'm trying. I'm trying to remember. It's hard. I just really feel awkward when I don't say the before Ukraine because I've been saying it that way my whole life.
Hmm.
But yeah, it should be Ukraine. It's an independent country now. It's just not some frontier territory of the Soviets or the Russians. So I'm working on it. That's a little self-improvement project.
Ukraine is pretty legit in the esports scene as well. Respect.
Is it?
Yeah. They had, I think Navi was Ukrainian, right? They were one of the best early Dota 2 pro teams. I think they won a TI. And then we have some StarCraft professionals from Ukraine as well.
Huh. Yeah, I didn't know that.
White Raws from Ukraine, I think.
Hmm. But just to wrap up that question, the fact that the US is pulling out and, basically taking its allies with it, I don't see that it is something of an isolationist move in sentiment, but overall, I don't think that reflects like an overarching isolationist foreign policy. There's a lot more to US global commitments than just Afghanistan. And again, Afghanistan is so unpopular with the American public, and it's such a, strategic and financial sinkhole. Getting out comes with a lot of strategic benefits in addition to the costs. So it's not as simple as just giving up on the conflict and pulling out. You can think of this also as recalibrating priorities. Does Agent Smith have any favorite video games? Gosh. I mean, that's kind of an ambiguous question in a way, because is one's favorite video game the one you most enjoyed playing or the one that had the biggest impact on you? Or is it the one that you play the most? Because those are not necessarily mutually inclusive categories.
What do you mean, like when you're hooked on Dota and you know that it's a game that's bad for your mental health, but you want to queue up anyway? Look, it's not my
Yeah,
favorite game, but I can't stop myself.
yeah. I play an unhealthy amount of Heroes of the Storm, even though I don't even think it's the best game, and I would never call it my favorite game. But just looking at the hours I put in, yeah, I could certainly be accused of it. Um, just to give you an example, when I was a kid, I really loved Final Fantasy VII. It was one of my favorite all-time games. And I haven't played the remake, but I did watch like all of the YouTube videos of people playing it just so I could see what they did with it. And that was quite the nostalgia trip. I really enjoyed that. So yeah, Final Fantasy VII is definitely a favorite, but it's not something I would go back and play necessarily because my favorite part was the story, and it's kind of like a book. Once you read it, you've kind of read it and you know what's going to happen. It can be fun to go back and read a book sometimes, but it's not something you're going to do necessarily like every month, every year, etc. Or at least I don't anyway. So in terms of games I like to go back and play repeatedly, I would say it would be something like Civ 3. Civ 3 is definitely one of my all-time favorite Civ games, and I, frequently find myself coming back to Civ at least like once a year or so.
Why 3 more than the other ones?
Your first love, Neuro, is the one that sticks with you the most.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah, that
that's.
was my first.
I can empathize with that with some of the early iterations of WoW are like really amazing games to me. Modern WoW, it's like I look at it and it's like some people are into this, but it's like a hard miss. So
Yeah.
yeah, I understand.
Yeah, Civ 3 was my first Civ game. I really got into it, really liked it as a kid. And so, the others definitely have their benefits. I played a lot of Civ 4 in college, so I have a soft spot for that one too. But even when it came out, I was not like a big fan of the 3D graphics. I didn't know why they did that. My computer had a really hard time running it because it was really old. So Civ 3 ran smoother. It was just, and I also just enjoyed the mechanics of Civ 3 a little more too. It was just smoother gameplay, in my opinion.
Have you
Civ
played
4 was very, huh?
have you played Northgard? Sorry to interrupt the Civ order.
Northgard. I don't think I have, actually. What is that?
It's another kind of builder game. I think it's a relatively new, small indie company kind of thing. You're building a
Vikings.
settlement, yeah, Viking flavor.
Hmm. I don't think I'd heard of it. Oh, there's the anime version.
So Civ 3 was your favorite. Civ 4.
Yeah, Civ 3 is my favorite. Civ 4 is pretty good. Civ 4 has more game mechanics than Civ 3. So, if you're looking for immersive gameplay, that's a pretty good way to go. That's a safe bet. Did you ever get around to playing Civ 4 Colonization?
No.
No, okay. Yeah, let me know if you ever do, because that's a fun one too. That's basically just it's an expansion, but it's more like a mod in a sense, and it's a very different gameplay. It's a lot
Mm.
of fun too. Yeah, Colonization, I've probably gone back and played more than I have Civ 4 at this point. But yeah, those are all fun. Civ 5 is fun. It's good. It's very streamlined. I think it has smoother gameplay than either Civ 4 or Civ 3, but it's just a little different. It doesn't have the same feel to me. And Civ 6 is cool. It has more game mechanics than I think any of the other games, but it's just a little cluttered, I think, at times. And it feels a little gamey. Is that a word I can use? There's so much optimization that you have to do in game that sometimes you lose the immersiveness of
Mm.
running a civilization. So I kind of feel like the earlier Civ games were more immersive in that sense.
Yeah, that was one of the things that people were all hyped about with classic WoW coming back was a lot of what you have to do in the original WoW is tedious, but it makes it feel more like you're in that world. Like you have to do these dumb chores and you have to just run errands for people because if you're actually trying to move up in your networks and in the military and things like that, you've got to clean the kitchen some of the time. Like you don't get to do the badass jobs straight out the gate. You have to do a bunch of boring stuff. So yeah, there's that balance in gaming of how much of the fun stuff do you let people do and then how much hard work do you require people to do to advance through different periods that might be less fun on its own but more realistic and immersive overall.
Mm, gotcha. Is Northgard like that?
I don't know. I think I played it a little bit to like test it out. I think it's probably more simple than Civ 6 in terms of just the number of different things that can happen and the number of options. So a comparison that I make for a lot of stuff is Star Wars Saga compared to The Mandalorian, where The Mandalorian is a more simple character with a lower power level, and you have a smaller set of worlds that he goes to, and the plot is more personal. I would guess Northgard is closer to The Mandalorian, and Civ 6 would be closer to Star Wars Saga, where it's a really big picture, lots of different factions, lots of different ways you can approach the game, and a ton of different mechanics.
Oh, interesting. They still making Star Wars games?
I think so. They've made some like Jedi Academy type stuff fairly recently. There was a Star Wars Squadrons game where you can fly around in planes and stuff. Oh, we had a World of Tanks promotion thing that's still technically going this week. One of our friends of this stream, Taurus, it turns out he's a tank enthusiast and he'll tell you about all the different tanks in the game. I would wager that you probably know a decent bit about some of the tanks in that game as well. Did you ever play that? World of
What was it
Tanks?
called again?
World of Tanks?
Oh, no, I actually haven't played that. I played like the competitor.
Hmm.
I forget what it was. It's like War Thunder or something. I want to say it was War Thunder because you can play ships, planes, and tanks. Yeah, okay, it was War Thunder. Yeah, I know some of the tanks, but they have a lot. They've got like individual variants and like customs and prototype. They've got a lot of stuff. If I was a kid, again, I would have loved that. I would have spent all my times memorizing all of the vehicles on there. But I was born a little too late, Neuro, or too early, rather. See, I think that's all the questions. Yeah, that's pretty much all the questions.
Nice. We're at a pretty good wrap up point. We did a few different episodes on China. This one will still be primarily focused on Afghanistan. We'll see how things develop there, but it's a rapidly changing set of circumstances, so maybe not too much happens, or maybe a ton of stuff happens by the time that we're on for next week. I issue you again the 20 minutes walk challenge.
Oh, God.
Oh, no. And chat as well. You've been formally challenged. This is a fitness 101 where walking is more healthy than sitting permanently. So at any point during the week, you can reach a total of 20 minutes walked outside, or if you're inside at like a track or something. Sometimes they have indoor tracks. That also counts. Just get the legs and the muscles and everything moving. Get a little bit of light cardio.
I'll try my best. I'll try to squeeze it in my busy schedule of eating pizza and reading the news.
Pizza, news, walk. Or you could walk before the pizza, and then you'll be super hungry, and it's going to taste amazing.
I don't know, man. I don't know about that.
We got to strategize our walking.
My grandmother would like that, I think. She likes to eat before she works. I like to eat after I work. Yeah, she grew up on a farm in rural Indiana, and it wasn't even like a really well-off farm, so food for her is a practical matter for the most part. Yeah, for me, it's what you do when you want to relax. It's something you do after your work.
I'm very food dependent in starting my day, so I've heard of these people who skip breakfast. If I skip breakfast, that's like an event that we need to solve. And whatever my tasks were for the day, I'm basically in a combat situation until I've gotten my breakfast. So better give me those oatmeal bowls and biscuits.
Oatmeal, is that good? Oatmeal bowls?
Well, I have a bowl of oatmeal in the morning. That's like my standard thing.
What do you eat?
It's just oats. Like, you know how you get one of those big cylindrical things of oats?
Oh, really?
You put that into a bowl, just the oats, and then you boil water on the stovetop. And then once it's boiling, you pour the water on the oats. They soak it up, but they're not too mushy. And then you can put some fresh fruit on top of that.
So you're eating actual oatmeal?
Yeah.
You're not eating like the sugary oatmeal I grew up with?
No, the packets and stuff?
Yeah.
No. I did have the packets growing up. Those aren't too bad, but the more you can just throw on processed stuff at yourself, I think that's better.
Yeah, you don't have to mince words, Neuro. It's not good for you. The stuff that's like sugar plus some oatmeal, that's probably not great for your system. As much as I may have liked the taste as a kid, I recognize fully it is not health food.
Yeah, it's a really easy breakfast. I got a couple other StarCraft people started on that, and they like it as well, because it might seem boring to try having oats every day, but if you have oats with blackberries and honey, and then you have oats with raspberries, and then you have oats with strawberry jam and a sliced banana, like you can mix and match it with some stuff that's also healthy, also does have sugar in it. You just find sugar from good places that are bonded to fiber instead of just powdered sugar and whatnot.
There you go. That's the spirit.
Well, thanks for helping break down the spicy topics and whatnot. War is always a messy affair, so
sure is.
We try to do our best, and if we said some stuff wrong, please help us. This is a conversation here where the chat and the people in the YouTube comments can participate and help us out. We do correction some of the time too, so if we said something wrong, then that can be remedied in a later episode. Thank you, Moss Neotech, for handling questions once again. Thank you, chat, for providing the questions. Thank you, Starian, for just throwing an extra tip for Mr. Agent Smith.
Oh, thank you, Starian.
Oh, yeah, great stuff.
And thank you. It's always a privilege, sir.
Thank you for coming on for another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
See you next time.
GG. And cut.